Welcome everybody. Getting started here. Just got to get people signed in.
Yeah, I hope I won't have much problems hearing this because there's like a serious thunderstorm going outside my house.
Yeah, it's we got woken up by it earlier on with the hail and everything. But yeah, it's thundering outside our house too.
How is your son doing?
He's fine. He had a issue like where he was having a lot of pain in his abdomen, and my wife was worried that it was appendicitis because it was in that area, and so we took him to the ER, but it wasn't. He just had some like blockage, I guess, in his gut somewhere, which was giving him a lot of gas pain, I guess. So
Well, I'm glad he's okay.
yeah, me too. I'm so glad they didn't have to cut him open or anything. That would, that would definitely have not been a pleasant experience at all. All right, well, I know that we'll probably have some more people join as we go here, but in the interest of just getting enough done, we'll get started. All right, so I know fourth block people, you've done this already, but I think we were talking about this just as the bell was ringing in sixth block. So oh, there's another person. All right, so because of the very serious events going on in Europe, the United States believe that we might be attacked at some point. Anybody, what possession of ours was the most likely point of attack, since it was closest to one of the fascist regimes that was expanding on a dramatic kind of basis?
Was it the Philippines?
Yes, Philippines is correct, Jacob. Yes. So basically, we knew that at some point we might get involved, and actually Roosevelt wanted to help in some way. He was becoming more and more of an internationalist and less of an isolationist. And so Congress passed and he signed a law which will affect all of you guys who are going to turn 18. I had to sign up when I was 18 as well. It's called the Selective Service and Training Act of 1940, which allows for a peacetime draft. So even though we weren't at war, we were already drafting troops in preparation for possibly being in war. And essentially the way it works is you have to serve for 12 months. And if you make it through your 12 months, you can come home unless the government is in extreme, extenuating circumstances, and then you can then they can hold you over for longer. But at first, they can draft you if you're between the ages of 21 and 35. But then if the war is really, requiring a lot of manpower, they can extend it to ages 18 to 45. And if it really gets intense and they really are in desperate need, they can extend it ages 18 to 65. And like I mentioned in the other class, as we get further into this war and America gets involved and we end up fighting on two fronts, we have a lot of troops over in Europe and we have a lot of troops out in the Pacific. They are drafting kids like before they even graduate high school. Like as soon as they turn 18, they're just getting drafted. And so hopefully we'll never be in a situation like that again, but it was a lottery system. Yes. Autumn, go ahead.
How much opposition existed to this at the time? Like, were there rallies or anything like that?
There is a significant amount, but It's not like World War I, where people were like, "This is not our war," because we will get hit at Pearl Harbor, and it will unite the country. So when that happens, the opposition to the draft isn't going to be as significant as it was in the First World War. Um, but it's definitely there, and really, in a lot of ways, it's more racial this time, and you're going to see that. We're going to talk about the race riots. And speaking of race, I also have in here that African Americans are drafted, uh, even though once they get into the armed forces, they find out that racism hasn't gone away. As a matter of fact, the American military was segregated, and African Americans were given all the worst jobs. So, they, like, if they were on a ship, they didn't get to go and fire the anti-aircraft gun or do any of the important jobs. They would be stuck down in the galley, cooking, cleaning, doing the toilets, etc. So, trying to keep up with the people who just started showing up. Let me see, what's the other person? All right. So anyway, that is kind of the draft, and America is prepping for the possibility. Now, of course, we don't expect to get hit at Pearl Harbor. We expect to get hit in the Philippines, but we will be ready to go when Pearl Harbor happens. All right. So, in spite of all the craziness going on in the world, there is a presidential campaign. And I find some of the parallels here to kind of present day politics a little funny. Roosevelt was basically kind of quote unquote drafted into running for a third term by all of his close friends and advisors. And Roosevelt didn't want to leave because of the momentous kind of things that were happening historically, and he wanted his hand on the wheel, so to speak, to kind of steer America towards what he thought would be our best course. And so, but he doesn't do a lot of campaigning. And the Destroyers for Bases initiative that he had put together, even though it made us a little less isolationist, it was popular because people didn't want to see Hitler take over the world. And, it was one of those things where America was doing something, but we weren't going over there and fighting. The Republicans were really searching for somebody who could be kind of like, the person to finally beat Roosevelt. And they ended up kind of like, there was going to be like a choice between Mr. Republican Robert Taft, the grandson of William Howard Taft, who had kind of paid his dues in the party, and it was his turn. He was a senator, and Thomas Dewey, who was kind of this up and coming. He was like a district attorney. He had brought down a bunch of mobsters in New York City, and the commission, the mafia, had actually like said, "Don't kill him." And one of the mobsters in New York City was going to try and kill him, and they actually sent some hitmen to kill that mobster instead. His name was Dutch Schultz. So those two guys both were serious contenders. But at the convention, everybody just kind of like got excited about a utilities executive, a guy who was just witty and gregarious and just really had an incredible amount of charisma, but very little political experience. His name was Wendell Willkie. And so at the Republican nominating convention, all of the delegates just switched their votes over to Willkie, and he basically, attacks Roosevelt's policies, but at the same time is supportive of the war effort, and well, not the war effort yet, but he's supportive of the effort to get America ready for potentially being involved, and for helping Britain, etc. So that is the campaign of 1940, and in an unprecedented, you know, again, landslide electorally, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins a third term in office, which is no president has ever done that before or since. And of course, when the 22nd Amendment is ratified in the 1950s, you know, terms are limited. And that was actually in response to Roosevelt winning so many terms in a row. So the voter loyalty that Roosevelt got from the Great Depression was still incredibly strong, even though you can see that in the popular vote, the Republicans did make some headway, and it was relatively close. All right, so Hitler is meeting with his generals in the winter of 1940-41, and they're like, okay, so we're gonna finish off Britain, right? You know, like that's the plan for the spring. And he's like, no, it's not. We're gonna invade Russia, is what he told them. And they're like, you know, just think of the enormous amount of like manpower and you know, the amount of space we would have to cover, and think about what happened when Napoleon tried to take Moscow and Tsar Alexander the First just kept retreating. You know, they had all of these, you know, worries that it was going to be a disaster for Germany. And Hitler was like, look at what happened in the Winter War. Finland, with 1/10 the men that the Russians had, was able to actually hold off and beat the Russian military. And so it's obvious that this is going to be super easy. He said it's like a rotten barn. All you got to do is just kick in the door and the whole thing's going to collapse. Stalin is not well liked by his people. If they take the capital, the people are not going to rally around him. And you know, their whole system is on the verge of collapse. He has decapitated his own army. And so he basically convinces them that Russia is ripe for the taking. If there was ever a moment to attack Russia, it was now. Go ahead, Ethan.
So, on the whole, you know, how his people didn't like Stalin part is like, oh yeah, they won't even fight that well. Well, did they consider the whole political ideology part of that, where they basically will murder each other because of how far apart they are politically?
Oh, you're just talking about communist versus yeah, like the Russian people were considered one of the lower races, the Slavs. They're kind of down there, you know, near the Jews as a lower race. So in Hitler's vision, where every German would have this great plantation farm, and of course Russia would be the place where you could provide, you know, a lot of that living space, that Lebensraum for the German people. The Russian people would be, you know, in the category of peasants or slaves.
Was there a mistake in his assumption that it would be like the Winter War? Like from initial views.
You're asking a really good question. Stalin does need somebody who knows what he's doing. And the question is, has he killed them all? Or is there somebody who knows what he's doing? Okay. And so I'm just gonna leave that hanging for a minute, because we're going to answer that question in just a little bit. But you're asking a really, really good question is, you know, somebody in Russia has to like respond to what the Nazis are doing. Now, obviously, when they were fighting Finland, they didn't have anybody competent who could really, you know, and they had to like basically bow out, and it was very embarrassing. So we'll come to that in just a little bit, but you're thinking along the right lines. All right, so Hitler has a very elaborate plan, and he wants to get started right away because he is worried about the Russian winter. And if you know anything about Napoleon, you know that the winter was one of his worst enemies in Russia. And so he wants to start in the spring and take out Russia right away. But there's a problem. And the problem is there's a back door. And the back door could potentially, if somebody were bold enough, lead right into the very, very heart of Germany and right up to Berlin. So this is the area we call the Balkans. I've got my pointer on it right here, and it includes Greece, uh, the little country of Albania right here, Yugoslavia, which used to be Serbia, but Serbia got a bunch of Austro-Hungarian territory. Then you got Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now Hitler had been pressuring all of these countries really, really strongly, saying, "You need to be our ally, or else." Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria had all caved, and they were all like, "Yes, we will be your ally. We will do what you want." But Yugoslavia, under the Serbs, refused. And the Serbs, the reputation of the Serbs, they're fierce, they're fighters, they'll never submit, kind of thing. And then the Greeks basically also refused to ally themselves with Hitler. And so Hitler was worried that the British might land troops in Greece and then basically march up through these friendly countries right here and have a back door into Berlin while his entire army was in Russia. So he needed somebody to slam the back door shut and prevent this. And that job went to Mussolini. So Mussolini, and also, by the way, there is another issue which has to do with resources. Hitler's only oil supply that he has direct control over is in one of these allied countries. It's in Romania at Ploesti. So again, if somebody were to, quote, come in the back door and march up through Yugoslavia, they could potentially cut him off from his only oil supply that he has. So Mussolini, who has done almost zilch, nothing, is given the job of slamming the back door shut. And so what he was supposed to do was basically go right across the Adriatic Sea, invade Albania, and then take out Greece, which would mean that Yugoslavia would be surrounded. Yugoslavia would be pressured again to try to force them to, capitulate and become allies with Hitler. And if they refused, then Mussolini was to attack and subdue this part of the Balkans. But if Greece was under their control, they wouldn't have to worry about any armies getting landed. And this just goes to show you how much Mussolini was all show and no actual, like, he didn't actually like accomplish stuff. It was all show. And so Mussolini invades Albania, and yes, he is able to take over Albania. So he's not completely and totally incompetent. But then when he attacks Greece, the Greeks are able to stop him at the Metaxas line, and they're actually able to defeat him. And so when he is defeated by the Greeks, Hitler is like, do I have to do everything myself? And so he has to postpone Operation Barbarossa, which is going to be really important later, because remember, the winter is going to be a real factor later. And then the Nazis have to invade Yugoslavia, and they are ruthless when they do, by the way, because Hitler is mad because he was supposed to be on his way to Russia at this point. So in the spring, they invade Yugoslavia and take out Greece as well. And so they secure their southern flank. And so Mussolini's failure leads to Hitler's intervention. And by the way, the British do try to land forces in Greece, but they have to abort after the Nazis kind of sweep in. And the Nazis do the biggest paratrooper assault in the war on the island of Crete, south of Greece. And so, yes, go ahead, Jacob.
Is it because of the Allies and like mostly Britain seeing Mussolini's failure that the Allies started to favor an invasion up through Italy?
Well, you'll see. Basically, what's going to happen, and you're asking a really good question, is Hitler's going to get himself involved in Russia, which means Russia is going to be thrust into the Allies, even though nobody likes Russia because Stalin is a bad guy. And then Stalin is going to have his hands full, and he's going to be like, can you guys help me? And so the question was how best to help him. And so the question was, do they attack right across the channel, which of course could lead to a blowback, could lead to the Nazis, attacking back. And when Winston Churchill was afraid, when the Nazis were really strong of that, or do they attack from North Africa and Italy instead? So they of course chose the easier route, and Stalin had to basically do a lot of the heavy lifting for all of 1943 as well. So really good question. We'll actually be kind of coming to that in a little bit, but the reason that they did it was because Winston Churchill at the Casablanca conference would convince Roosevelt that it was better to go to Italy, and we believe that the reason that he did that is because he was afraid that if they invaded across the channel in 43, that that the Nazis, who were really strong at that point, would basically kind of attack back, and Britain could be wiped out. Nick, go ahead.
How did Mussolini lose in Greece? Because I'm assuming he had a much larger army than the Greek army at the time, correct? And he also had
Well, I
probably-
mean, yeah, he had drafted a whole bunch of guys, and essentially what it was is they just weren't efficient at like actual military maneuvers, and when the guys he had in command were not real capable. Like in Hitler's army, it was very much a meritocracy. People who were smart rose to the top. In Mussolini's military, it was much more political, and people who really didn't know what they were doing were commanding troops and making big mistakes. And a lot of it was just strategic errors. It wasn't that they were outgunned or anything else. It just that they were they were being led by people who just made dumb strategic decisions. And so and a lot of it's just because of how the promotion system worked within the Italian military, and etc. So that's the conquest of the Balkans. And just remember that one of the big kind of side effects of this is that this is going to make it so Hitler has to postpone his invasion of Russia until the summer. So while all of this is happening, the British actually end up having some success against Mussolini again. So I got two more people who just joined. Hold on a second here. Mark them down. Essentially, Mussolini's colony, the Italian colony of Libya, was overrun by British forces who were able to like push the Italians all the way across Libya and kind of like get control of the entire colony. And Hitler knew that there was another back door. And if I could roll back up here just for a second, just so you can see the map here, the other back door is to use Italy as a staging ground to attack, use North Africa as a staging ground to attack Italy, which, Mussolini was proving to be very weak and unreliable. And so the Nazis, again, have to do everything themselves. And so Hitler sends one of his best tank commanders, a guy who had stood out when they had invaded France, and Heinz Guderian, the guy who had basically developed the Panzer Corps, had immediately recognized his talent, and he had been promoted all the way up. His name was Erwin Rommel, and Erwin Rommel is going to be one of the most skilled commanders on land during World War II. And with only one division of panzers, he is going to retake Libya against the British, who had superior numbers, and basically threaten British Egypt, which was the doorway to the Middle East. And if the Nazis got control of the Middle East, they would get control of the Allied oil supply, which of course the British were terrified that if that would happen. And so he, because of his brilliance as a commander, Rommel is able to kind of completely turn things around with with only one division of tanks, and threaten Egypt. And that's kind of we'll leave the story there and we'll come back to it in a little bit. But he is so wily, so capable, that he gets the nickname the Desert Fox. So the Nazis are basically, just doing everything. They've taken out the Balkans. They've recaptured North Africa. So all of Mussolini's failures are being made up for by Hitler, and now they are ready for the big show. But before we talk about that, we need to come back over to America and talk about another one of the great spies of World War II. This is William Stevenson. He was a close personal friend of Winston Churchill, and he wasn't spying on the Nazis. He was in America, and his mission was to basically get America involved in the war. And so he became he actually had, he was like a millionaire. He had developed a technology for sending pictures over radio waves, which eventually that technology will be adapted and be the basis for television. The reason that television wasn't a thing yet was because the receiver sets were still too expensive. But he was already a millionaire, and basically he came over as an advisor sent by the British to help us set up our own kind of like version of MI6. Like MI6 basically is the British spy. It's like their version of the CIA. There is no CIA yet, but they help us set up the predecessor to the CIA, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. So like this guy right here, I mean, he's helping us set it all up. He's like, no, this is how you do it. This is how you do it. And he is in the know on everything, like top secret stuff. He knows it all. And essentially what he does is he skews a lot of the intelligence that he is getting from MI6, because they're sharing intelligence with the United States, to make it look as threatening as possible, like that the Germans are a real existential threat to the United States. Because of course, as you saw in the speech that Winston Churchill gave, the Never Surrender speech, that his greatest hope is for a repeat of what happened in World War I, where America, with all of its might, would come in and save the Allies once again. And so he's kind of pinning his hopes on that, but he's not just hoping, he's actively manipulating through William Stevenson. And so Stevenson is basically showing FDR maps where he's like, we have intelligence that shows that the Germans are planning on invading Latin America. They've already got a friendly dictator down in Argentina, Juan Perón. They're going to use him, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of funny, even though Churchill and Roosevelt are close friends, as the war develops, Churchill is manipulating Roosevelt the whole time through Stevenson. And I think actually in this picture, you can see Stevenson. We have to have a more zoomed in version, but he's in this group of guys right here behind them. Basically, Churchill is looking for a way to get us interested in the fight against Hitler. And does anybody remember what was the draw for Wilson? Like Wilson, if he got America involved, would get the chance to do what? It wasn't territory that we wanted. It was the chance to do what?
Basically have a role at the speaking table of like international qualms and borders and disputes.
Okay, and then Faith, what were you going to add anything to that?
Yeah, basically establish us as a formidable military power.
Okay. But yeah, we want a chance to kind of like, fix the international system the way we think it should work, etc. And so again, Churchill's like, well, he's pinning everything on America getting involved, and because like without America, the Allies just don't have the firepower, and he doesn't know that Russia is, about to become one of the allies yet. So he takes a huge risk. He flies across the Atlantic Ocean on a bomber, which if it were shot down, he would be dead. And of course, Hitler wanted very, very much to kill him. And he meets with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt cannot invite him to Washington, D.C. Why? Why can't Roosevelt receive Winston Churchill in Washington, D.C.? Nick, go ahead.
They're still technically neutral.
Yeah, it would be a violation of the Neutrality Acts. People would be up in arms. Faith, did you want to add to that?
I just thought it would look like people were meeting to like get us involved in the war, basically what Nick was saying.
Right, and it's still incredibly politically unpopular at this point. People are absolutely against that, and so they have to meet on an aircraft carrier off the coast of Canada, off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and so it's neutral. It's international waters, and so since it's kind of in a neutral area, then he's not, receiving a member of the Allies in Washington, D.C., and et cetera, et cetera. So while they're on this aircraft carrier, Churchill is like, okay, what is your vision for the future of the world? Now, does anybody remember what was Wilson's what speech did he give that kind of laid out his vision? Yes, Elizabeth.
Wasn't it the every nation gets its own state thing?
Yeah, which is a part of what speech was that a part of? Remember, there were like a bunch of different points. Was
it 14 points?
14 points. Yes, right, very good. Yeah, the 14 points. And so this basically is the 14 points of World War II. And so Roosevelt lays out his vision, because Roosevelt does want to kind of like fix things so the world doesn't have any more conflicts like this. And so in the Atlantic Charter, they basically say, okay, that any territorial gains or losses in this war are going to basically be get done according to the people who live in the area, the wishes of the people who live there. So if they want to be a part of a country, then their wishes are going to be, so it's again, the every nation has its own state thing is kind of revived. The United States and the UK promise this time that they're not going to get any new territory. So it's not like after World War I, where, the UK basically takes over most of the Middle East and gets, big chunks of the Ottoman Empire. This time there is no gaining territory. But here's the kicker. The Atlantic Charter basically says that people around the world, and we're not just talking about Europe this time, people around the world have the right to self-determination. What giant system and movement that we talked about that was, part of the 1800s that America had gotten involved in for a little while under Teddy Roosevelt, and that Britain was heavily involved in, is this flying in the face of imperialism, yeah. And Elizabeth, did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say the same thing.
Same thing. Okay. So basically, Winston Churchill, who is like one of the biggest imperialists in Britain, he's like an empire guy. He's going to call Gandhi all kinds of names, when Gandhi is trying to get India its independence, and Gandhi had started out in the 20s and had worked his way, he had done a lot, up through the 30s. And I think, what did he call him? He called him like a half naked Indian something, and just, denigrated him. But Roosevelt's like, so you agree that every group of people around the world should have the right to self-determination. And Churchill wants America involved so badly that he's like, yes, I do. But really, that's a really hard thing for him to say. And so free trade, freedom from want and fear, freedom of the seas, Global cooperation, mutual disarmament also are all parts of the charter. These are all things that had been, discussed, either in the 14 points or in the 20s. And so Churchill agrees to it all. He agrees to it all. He's like, basically, the 14 points of America for World War II, the Atlantic Charter, I agree to everything. And he wants something in return. And this is what Stevenson had been prepping Roosevelt for. This is the one thing that Churchill had done all of this for. And he says, okay, let's say you get hit by the Japanese at some point, most likely the Philippines. Who do you think is the bigger threat in the world? The Nazis or the Japanese? And Stevenson had been, giving all of this intelligence to Roosevelt, trying to convince him this was the big moment. And Roosevelt's like, oh, I would definitely say it's the Nazis. And Churchill's like, yes. So he's like, how about this? If you ever do get involved, let's agree that we want to deal with Germany first. Okay, Germany is the bigger threat to the world. And of course, really the bigger threat to Britain. I mean, they're all alone fighting Germany right now, and they just don't have the manpower. And so if America ever does get involved, if there ever is some attack that, causes the neutrality acts to go away, then we're going to agree that we need to deal with Germany first. And Roosevelt's like, yes, totally agree. So both sides kind of get what they want. And the Atlantic Charter is going to have some big implications, because you're going to see after World War II, those giant empires are going to fade away as decolonization takes place, as a lot of the ideas here in the Atlantic Charter are going to be put into effect through the United Nations. So Britain has just agreed to give up its empire. And of course, we'll see how that all plays out. But Roosevelt, and you can see here in these pictures that he's getting more and more gaunt and just drawn out, and his health is just, is slowly starting to fade. He basically makes a speech because he was so inspired by his, his interaction with Churchill and Stevenson, that, he wanted America on board with this vision he has for kind of peace and security and the future, etc. And so he gives this speech, which becomes famous, known as the Four Freedoms speech. And in this speech, I mean, he really kind of basically is like coming out as an internationalist. Like, everybody's like, okay, he's not an isolationist. He really is an internationalist. And he says that, and this is really actually many historians kind of call this the foundation of modern liberalism in America. But he says there's four basic freedoms that all human beings on the planet deserve. And that is, and Norman Rockwell, by the way, who we'll talk about in the next packet, one of the great painters of America, will make some paintings based on these four freedoms. There's freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are his paintings. Freedom from fear, which means that you shouldn't have to worry about like being attacked by some fascist dictator somewhere. Like, the world needs to unite to put these people down. That's the internationalist part. And freedom from want, okay, which is of course part of his whole approach to the Great Depression, which is, no family should starve. Everybody should have, that economic prosperity. And so, the government intervening with social programs. Go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah. I think everyone could agree on the first two, maybe the third.
Yeah.
But I guess the fourth is pretty hard for a lot of people to, take with it.
Right. Because it's not that social Darwinist kind of like, philosophy that really was the foundation of American capitalism in the 1800s, which is, well, oh, you're mad that you're poor? Well, guess whose fault it is? It's your fault because you're not working hard enough. So that this is the opposite. This is where the government is going to kind of come in almost what we call the nanny state, and just kind of like say, we're going to take care of everybody. We're going to take care of you and make sure you're okay. So kind of this is a fundamental shift, and really because FDR is so successful as a president, as a party leader, he's going to have enormous influence over the future of the Democratic Party and their philosophies. Everybody wants to keep going back and repeating the success of FDR. On that side, so because he's pretty much out of the closet as an internationalist, so to speak, he's no longer pretending to be isolationist. FDR signs the most the most non-neutral thing that we've done so far, which is a bill in March of 1941 called Lend-Lease. And this is a fundamental shift for America. Essentially, at this point, we're just saying to Britain, oh, you can't afford to pay us for these ships right now and these planes. Guess what? We'll lend them to you. Now, are we going to get them back in like good shape again? When they're done with them, are they not going to be, most of them going to be full of bullet holes and probably no longer?
I mean, you'd probably expect them to.
Yeah. I mean, so essentially what we're doing is we're giving stuff to them, so we basically are just manufacturing stuff, and the government's taking out loans. They're paying these factories in America, so you got all of these factories just kind of like hiring people because there is an endless supply of work. There is an incredible demand for war materials, whether it be equipment or munitions or whatever it is, food, etc. Just an incredible. So America essentially starts being the big supplier of Britain. Now, of course, when the other big allies, now, and I almost forgot to mention this, China, of course, is still in the war, and they are fighting the Japanese. And so once America gets involved, China will be considered a member of the Allies as well. So we start supplying the entire Allied war effort. Not only are we supplying Britain with an enormous amount of equipment, much of which is just to keep the sea lanes open to their island in the Battle of the Atlantic, but we're also going to end up supplying Russia when Russia gets involved, and we'll end up supplying China as well. So even before the war, even before we are involved in the war, before Pearl Harbor, we become the quote unquote, and please write this down, the arsenal of democracy. So what does that mean? The arsenal of democracy. What is an arsenal?
Well, I'd assume it's because we are the ones supplying them, so we have all the weapons that we're giving to them.
Yeah, like you got to have equipment to fight this war. This war is a mechanized war. You got to have tanks. If you want to beat tanks, the only way to beat tanks is with tanks. I mean, there's other things that can kill tanks too, but you got to have planes. You got to have an air force. You got to have a navy, and it's equipment. And so somebody's got to supply that. And the great thing about being the United States is nobody can bomb out our cities. We are an ocean away from everybody else. So our factories don't have to worry about getting bombed out and having their production schedules interrupted by bombing, because we're way far away from the other fascist powers, and it's just not practical for them to come and try to bomb us. And so we end up supplying the entire Allied war effort with an incredible amount of material. And that's going to make a huge difference in whether the Allies win or lose in World War II. Yes, Ethan.
Does this kick off like the war material, like scientific development into overdrive in like Germany and Britain and all those other countries?
Yes, Germany has a very kind of efficient factory system, and they keep shifting between the various phases of what they need. So sometimes they'll be shifting into U-boat production, and they'll like really push for more and more U-boats.
Yeah.
But then they'll shift over. Well, go ahead.
What I'm saying is, like, since basically Britain's like supply isn't tied to its own production anymore, really the edge you got now is how good is your tanks and how good are your ships.
Right, and the research and development phase, actually the Nazis are going to be on the cutting edge for most of the war. So like, yes, America will develop the Sherman tank, but the Nazis will already have a tank that can kill the Sherman tank. Like in the desert in North Africa, we're going to find out when you go up against a Panzer IV with a Sherman, the Panzer IV can penetrate the Sherman's armor with its gun, and so that's going to give Rommel a critical advantage in some battles, like Kasserine Pass, etc. Elizabeth, go ahead.
So was this kind of what brought the U.S. economy back, or did that kind of happen earlier at the beginning?
The U.S. economy had been recovering because of the demand that was out there and the fact that we were able to supply them. But this is going to be kind of like the crowning kind of, moment where we totally go over into war production. And really, by this point, everybody who wants a job can find one because factories are just producing stuff right and left. I mean, we become this incredible, like we were pumping out these ships that are like merchant ships that basically carry goods to Britain, called Liberty ships. We are pumping them out faster than the Nazi U-boats can sink them. And this is even before we get involved. And so recognizing that we are really not really that neutral anymore, Hitler will actually respond to Lend-Lease by sinking an American merchant ship, the USS Robin Moore, in May of 1941. He's recognizing that really we're not neutral. Like we're definitely on one side of this. And of course, throughout World War II, we are going to spend $50 billion on Lend-Lease, which at the time was a ton of money. Nowadays, that's nothing, but at the time, that was a ton of money. Yes, Ethan.
Was this on the level to Germany like the Russian boogeyman in terms of keeping people off, like in the war efforts, like what they did with Russia at the beginning?
Oh, just scaring people in terms of like...
No, I mean, like, was this like basically like how at the beginning they didn't want Russia to be there so they could handle something else first? Was this also like what basically made them fearful of, that person basically is already in?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like they like, are they afraid that America is going to get involved while they're dealing with Russia? Hitler does recognize that the United States could be a threat, but Germany doesn't have to worry about a second front right now because they've taken out France. So Europe is Fortress Europe, and the fortifications have been built up like crazy. So whenever they're feeling all like worried about American and British involvement, they just keep beefing up their fortifications on the coast. So of course, by the time we actually try to attack those, on D-Day, they're going to be formidable. But yeah, Hitler, whenever he's feeling like, oh crud, what about the United States? They're like, well, just beef up the fortifications along the coast. And essentially, because they don't have, a front in France to worry about, the US doesn't really have a place to put all those troops. All we're doing right now is supplying equipment. So that is going to take us to one of the greatest intelligence coups of World War II. It's hilarious. This is so funny. Now, we talked about Hess, the deputy Führer, right? What's his one redeeming quality, even though he's not very smart? The
super loyal.
Super loyal, okay, but he's not very smart, okay? And the British know this. And the British also happen to know that he is a big astrology person, okay? Like he will do stuff based on astrological charts, and he will sometimes not even set foot outside his house sometimes when he feels like the stars are against him or whatever. And so a particular MI6 agent who will later become famous for writing some novels, Ian Fleming. Anyone? What novels does he write? Does anyone know? Oh, come on. All right. Famous British spy who goes around the world and has adventures. Still, we're having movies made.
Oh, James Bond.
Yes. The author of the James Bond novels later is an actual spy during World War II, Ian Fleming. His code name was 17F. And he comes up with this elaborate plan to essentially capture Deputy Fuhrer. And the plan is, now, this would never work on anyone who was like decently smart, but the plan is they are going to basically lean on the Swiss astrologist who Hess consulted all the time, and basically have that astrologer say, well, the hour of destiny has come. The planets have all aligned, and this is the moment that you are meant to give Hitler what he really wants, which is the surrender of Britain. There are top people in Britain, like Lord Halifax and others, who are willing to negotiate a British surrender. They just need someone they can negotiate with, and they will bypass Winston Churchill, and they will make Britain, drop out of the war. Britain is like a ripe apple. It's ready to drop. Someone just needs to come along and pluck it. And so, without telling a soul, Rudolf Hess gets in a plane by himself and flies over Britain at night, of course, so he won't get shot down, and parachutes out of the plane and lands in a Scottish farmer's field, because he is convinced that if he goes over to Britain himself secretly, that Britain will drop out of the war. And so he's arrested by a Scottish farmer who finds this Nazi in his farm field, and is then taken back to London, and he's imprisoned for the rest of the war. And so on that kind of ruse, they capture the number 2 Nazi. And when Hitler hears about it, he issues a very short statement. He says, "Hess did not fly in my name." So that's it for Rudolf Hess. He's now in prison. But actually, this will work out well for him, because after the war in the Nuremberg trials, he is going to not get as stiff of a sentence as a lot of the other Nazis, because he's not there for a lot of the Holocaust. Eiley, go ahead.
So was Hess more of an astrology side or astronomy side? Like, did he believe in zodiacs, or was it more constellations?
Zodiacs, yeah. I mean, for astrology, like, it's like they believe that like you're born under a constellation. Like you read your horoscope and stuff, and so he's taking reading the horoscopes to a whole new level. Like, he takes them as gospel. Like, you read your horoscope and it says, now is a fortuitous time to make business deals, and you're like, okay,
So he's one of those people.
But no, he's one of those people to like a ridiculous degree. So he's like, oh, okay, I must do what the horoscope says. So now I must look for business deals, and I must do it. Yes, Ethan, go ahead.
Well, good thing that Germany was already in the war before something like this happened, because Hitler would lose his backup tactic. But
right,
yeah, good thing they're already in the war.
Right. I mean, you have to give the British credit for this one, though. This is like, just knowing Hess and knowing his psychology, they were able to take advantage of that. So just an interesting little story there. All right. So because the British merchant ships that were coming across the Atlantic were facing incredible danger as they were part of Lend-Lease, President Roosevelt ordered U.S. naval ships to accompany British ships as far as Iceland. So this is what we talked about with the Battle of the Atlantic, with the convoy system, where the American Navy would escort these ships, many of which we were producing for the British. So these were really literally American ships, but we're just like, here, they're yours. We became part of the convoy system. So when the German submarine U-652 fired upon the American destroyer USS Greer on September 4th, 1941, President Roosevelt issued his, quote, shoot on sight order. And this basically meant that all US ships were to shoot German submarines on sight. Is this really, like, are we neutral at this point? I mean, is this an act where you're like basically saying, go ahead and commit acts of war against Germany? Yes, Eiley.
Oh. Though it's not necessarily neutral, I can see how they can use the excuse of defense.
Right.
being like,
Well,
oh, hey, we're just defending ourselves in preparation.
but you know how like we talked about the quasi-war back when John Adams was president, and like the French were sinking our ships and we were sinking their ships out in the Atlantic Ocean, but we hadn't actually like declared full-on war, but it was like pretty much as close as you can get to a war without actually like being at war.
Yeah.
That's kind of where we're at right now. Like, yeah, and so uh now, there are some serious isolationists still. So, isolationist Senator David Walsh of Massachusetts investigated this incident, um, and his findings in the incident prevented a declaration of war from, when their submarine fired upon our ship, because again, that is an act of war. So we would have been justified in a response, but people do not want a repeat of World War I. And technically, that was what gave us the excuse to get involved in World War I, was they were doing unrestricted submarine warfare on our ships. And so shoot on sight is out there so the military can kind of protect itself as it escorts ships. But at the same time, we're not able to actually use these shootings upon our ships as an excuse to go to war. Now, we do need to talk real quick about civil rights at this time. The civil rights activist Philip Randolph, who really, honestly, should get more credit in the civil rights movement, was one of the great friends and mentors of Dr. King, et cetera, later, got a victory in civil rights when he basically through his influence, was able to get President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, which said that companies that are receiving contracts from the government could not be discriminated against based on race, creed, color, or national origin. So unlike Wilson, who would not give a single contract to a Black-owned company, Black-owned companies now were getting defense contracts. And if the federal government were to discriminate, they could file a complaint through a new body that had been created called the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, which basically was there to investigate any instance where the government refused to give a contract to a Black-owned company. And of course, Roosevelt would later strengthen that with Executive Order 9346, which ordered that all government contracts contain a non-discrimination clause. So the bonanza of federal defense contracts that is basically reviving the economy in all parts of the country, Black-owned businesses are able to get in on that bonanza as well, which really, really helps a lot of African Americans. Yes, Autumn.
Why does it say that it wasn't effective in the South?
Well, most of the African Americans in the South were still kind of in the poor sharecropper mode. So the South isn't industrialized yet. Okay, so there's not a lot of Black-owned factories. Like Black people don't own like big businesses and factories. There are factories in the South, but they're white owned. And so you remember we talked about that, like post-Civil War, the New South, you have Birmingham Steel and these other factories, but because of how like segregated and Jim Crow the South is, Black people are relegated to like the lowest status possible. So Black-owned businesses, those Black-owned businesses that do get defense contracts are usually in other parts of the country. But remember, because of the Great Migration, there were Black, population centers in pretty much every major city at this point. So that is the FEPC, and that takes us to more U.S. meddling in international affairs, which is going to have some consequences that we don't foresee. We were worried about the Free French, okay, under Charles de Gaulle, who were trying very hard to hold on to the valuable French colonies. The most valuable of all of the French colonies in terms of resources was French Indochina, which is what is now modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the Japanese were trying, because the Chinese would not submit, they were trying to kind of like go around the coast and basically cut China off from the rest of the world. And of course, China was getting supplied through French Indochina and through British Burma. And so through India, there were supply lines that were basically keeping the Chinese forces alive, so to speak, Chiang Kai-shek's forces. And so we did not want the Japanese to attack French Indochina. So we tried to use economic sanctions to dissuade them. And essentially what we said to them was, if you attempt to seize French Indochina, which again, the Free French really didn't want this to happen, we will freeze all of your assets. And that meant that all transactions, and of course the British were going to cooperate with us as well, all transactions would be frozen. The Japanese would no longer be allowed to trade. And I want to see if anybody knows, what resource does Japan not have direct control over right now that they have to trade to get? Yes, Ethan.
Would that be oil?
Yes. And Zach, what were you going to say?
Oh, I thought it was iron ore, but they have North China right now,
right,
so that wouldn't be relevant.
Right. So they have Manchuria under their direct control right now. So iron ore, they have access to that, but it is oil. And so what happens is they attack French Indochina and take it over. So the Japanese pretty much are in control of that territory. And so we do what we said we were going to do. We impose the sanctions. We have essentially cut off the Japanese oil supply. And that is going to cause some serious changes in Japan, because if their oil supply runs out, all their tanks, all their ships, all their planes are suddenly useless. They've got to have oil. So we have suddenly gone from kind of an annoyance to an existential threat to them. Yes.
There's a really cool scene from the movie Midway at the very beginning of the movie. It's when Admiral Yamamoto is talking to Leighton. Yes. And he talks about how if you back them into a corner, it will push them to drastic measures, aka Pearl Harbor.
Yes. Yeah, and actually, General Tojo will come into power because of this. He will become the new prime minister, and then he's basically he's a general, and he's just like, okay, if we don't have America like opening up the arteries of trade again by this date, then we're just going to attack him. And then that's when he orders Yamamoto to basically design the attack, which will become Pearl Harbor. So yes, very good. And by the way, I love that movie. So
Midway is probably my favorite War in the Pacific movie.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of World War II movies, but that one was so good. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, Admiral Yamamoto is an interesting individual that doesn't really get investigated much.
I would say he is the greatest naval commander of World War II.
It's like mainly it's like with him just working with the stuff he has, and with already like generals above him who are just complete pains in the butt, like he still somehow works through.
He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. You're going to see how dangerous he was when we get to it, but I won't spoil it.
I think specifically he did warn, it's like, hey, let's not do Pearl Harbor, maybe later.
Well, yeah, people make a big deal out of his, sleeping giant quote, which turned out to be true. But he does effectively almost completely wipe out our ability to interfere in the Pacific with Pearl Harbor. We'll get to that in a little bit. I don't want to completely spoil it. Jacob, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Because you have your hand still up.
Wasn't there like a whole like really big divide between the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army? Like the two didn't really get along all that well.
Yes, there were rivalries between the two. Yes. Because of course the Army is really heavily involved in China, but the Navy is going to become very important because of they have to get their hands on oil. So they have direct control of an oil supply. So they're going to have to create an empire in the Pacific in water, kind of out in this area here. And that will become the realm of the Navy. And so the Navy and the Army are going to continue to have this rivalry going on over, where do the resources go? Where does the manpower go? Et cetera. And then Eiley, go ahead.
When did Japan start using a government and stop using like shoguns and emperors and stuff?
That was in the Meiji Restoration, which happens in 1868. Essentially, because America, remember the Commodore Perry thing where we went in and we like forced Japan to open up its ports?
Yeah.
That's going to come back to bite us really, because Japan realized, oh, we're still in medieval mode. We're all walking around with swords. And they were like one of the most warlike societies on the planet, but they were all stuck in medieval mode. And they're like, we need better weapons. And so unlike China, which is like, European weapons are stupid, they're like, give us all these new weapons. And so we made a lot of money selling them all these new weapons, but these businessmen known as the oligarchs support restoring the emperor to power as kind of an excuse, as a way to overthrow the last shogun. And then basically they modernized Japan. Like I call it extreme makeover country edition, because in like the space of like a decade or so, Japan goes from being one of the most backwards and medieval societies in the world, where people are walking around with swords in the 1800s, to being like one of the most advanced militaries on the planet. And they then will embarrass the Russians. I think you remember we talked about this in the Russo-Japanese War, just completely sinking two Russian fleets and embarrassing Russia. Because their ships were so modern, because they just completely transformed their society. So, but they retained that warrior spirit, that Bushido kind of warrior spirit, even though the samurai were no longer a thing. Ethan, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think it was like 3 years before the event of the Japanese assets being frozen. There's a very special ship being built alongside, a bit off the sides of Nagasaki ports, that for some reason has a lot of curtains around it, and nobody really wants people to find out what it is.
Yes. All right. Again, we're foreshadowing. We're talking about stuff that we're going to get to. So I'm gonna hold off on like the full explanation of this, because we're about to get to it. All right. While all of this is going on, over on the Eastern Front, Hitler is finally ready for the big show, which is the invasion of Russia. Okay. And remember, his generals have given him their input. And so this does include the input of the top, military minds of Germany. And it is a very effective kind of plan. So essentially, this is how it's going to work, because this is like super complicated. Like we could spend forever on all the details here, but I'm trying to like nutshell it for you. So here's essentially kind of the nutshell version. The Germany, with allied support, with support from Italian troops and Romanian troops and Bulgarian troops that are under the command of German officers and whatnot, they're going to invade the USSR on a massive front, which is going to extend, from the Black Sea up to the Baltic Sea. And that front is going to be supported by tank columns, okay? And those tank columns are going to be divided into three big army groups. Army Group North, which has its own set of tanks, is going to go for the previous capital of Russia, which had been called St. Petersburg, but had been renamed Leningrad. Because they didn't want, if Moscow were taken, they didn't want the Russians to just suddenly switch over to the other capital. They wanted to deny them both capitals. Army Group Center was going to go they're going to take the Napoleon route, and they're going to go straight at Moscow, okay? And they're going to try and take out Moscow. And Army Group South was going to go for the oil fields, which are on the other side of the Black Sea. There's a massive amount of oil down in the Caucasus region. There's a mountain range down here on this side of the Black Sea, in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And so they're going to go for, and of course, they're also going to go for the grain that is in what is now modern day Ukraine. And so you can see here that the invasion is just like, it is the biggest land operation in history. But it's actually very successful. So what ends up happening is you'll have a Russian army that'll come out and it'll meet a German army. And while the troops are fighting, the German panzers, the tank divisions, this is why those columns of tanks are so important, will punch through the Russian lines on either side and will come around behind the Russian army and essentially cut that Russian army off, completely encircle it. This is what's called a pincher move. And because Russia is being led by a bunch of incompetent, political people, essentially the Russian army just keeps falling for the same thing over and over and over again. So the progress that they make is amazing. Like they get 2/3 of the way to Moscow by August, which is just like, so they're making up for all that lost time in the spring because the Russians are led by a bunch of idiots. They take 590,000 prisoners, and behind the regular German army become some SS units. The SS units are known as the Einsatzgruppen. And the Einsatzgruppen are mobile killing squads. And what they're essentially, they're commanded to do, they are commanded to take out the two biggest threats that the Nazis see to maintaining their control over the territories that they've taken. And those are the partisan leaders that are like communists, like any top communists were rounded up and shot. And then the other group was Jews. Now, of course, there are so many Jews that live in this area that there's no way the Einsatzgruppen could shoot them all, because there's like millions and millions. This is the area known as the Pale of Settlement, where most of the Jews had settled and kind of multiplied because in Catholic Europe, they had been persecuted during the time of the Crusades, etc. So many of them had moved over into kind of the Eastern Orthodox areas and had settled down. So like Eastern Europe or Russia had a ton of Jews, like millions and millions. So the SS killing squads killed a lot of them. I mean, not a lot of, they killed a lot of their leaders. But of course, there's just way too many civilians for them to line up and shoot. But top communists and top Jews were executed by these mobile killing squads. Eiley, I saw your hand real quick. Did you have any questions?
I was gonna ask something, but I saw it's in a later slide.
Okay. All right. So I just want you to look at the map real quick. Does anyone notice a problem, a flaw in Hitler's great plan? Is there
There's kind of a bulge in the center?
Yes.
They're missing a column.
Yes, there is a pocket of stubborn resistance around what is now the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. And of course, if you know anything about Russian history, you know that some of the most barbaric and hard to control people in Russia, the Cossacks, that's essentially the Ukrainians. Okay, so they have this long history of just being very, very difficult to control. And so Hitler gets worried. Okay, he gets freaked out because everything's going according to plan. He's almost to Moscow. He's 2/3 of the way there, and his generals are like, just get Stalin, just take Moscow. It'll all collapse if you do it. But he's worried. And by the way, Hitler has a personal doctor, and I think we've mentioned this once or twice before, that has been giving him vitamin shots. But really, in the vitamin shots, he is sticking all kinds of crazy stuff in there, including some experimental drugs which are being developed. By the way, drugs like methamphetamine have been developed during this time because both the Japanese and the Germans are interested in keeping their pilots awake for long periods of time. So Hitler is getting this drug cocktail, which makes him really antsy, and he micromanages everything. Like the German generals normally would just control the military stuff. He would be the political leader. He would say, accomplish this, and then they would go and plan it out and accomplish it because they know what they're doing. But at this point, he's very agitated, and he's like, no, I want to make the decisions. I want to control things. And so they have to come and lay out the maps, and they have to explain their thoughts to him, and he gets to make all those decisions. And in spite of their advice, he basically cannot stop obsessing over this what we call a salient in the line, this bulge in the line around Kiev. And he's like, what if the Russians like do like a thing where they cut our supply lines, and and like, what if, you know, the British help them and they like go like this, and they're like, they're not, they can't, they're on their heels, they're barely holding on. But he's like, you know, he's freaked out about it. So against the advice of his generals, and this again is where military historians basically come back and say this is Hitler's greatest mistake. If he hadn't done this, if he hadn't been such a I don't know what you call it, he hadn't been so anxious and worried about, like, you know, all the little possible back doors, you know, they would have won. Like, so but essentially what he does is he says, okay, we're going to peel some panzers off of Army Group Center, which had the majority of like they had more panzers than any of the other groups. And we're going to send some of them up to help with the stubborn resistance around Leningrad, where they could not cut the city completely off from the Russians, who were kind of stubbornly holding on. And he was going to peel off more panzers, like a significant number of panzers, to go south and to deal with Kiev. And I want to see if anybody knows, why is this important? What is this going to do to the progress that Army Group Center is making towards Moscow? Okay, I see a bunch of hands. Mackenzie, go ahead. Or Kenzie, go ahead.
It's going to slow them down significantly.
Boom. Yes. Eiley, okay, well, it seems like you've lowered your hand. Ethan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was saying, like, if they do that, it would just move the bulge over to Moscow.
Yeah, it's that, but it's all about speed, because why do they want to get there fast?
Because like, winter comes in like 2 months.
Right, and Russian winters are insane. Okay, yeah. So basically that is that is going to be considered his greatest mistake. Again, at the time, everybody was just like, they were amazed at how much progress Hitler had made so fast. Like, because he was right about the Russian military. It was a mess because Stalin had destroyed a lot of it. So you can see here that they do end up like cutting Leningrad off from the rest of Russia. So Army Group North is successful with those extra panzers. And you can see also that that bulge around Kiev disappears, and the front now looks more like it's supposed to. But the progress towards Moscow is slowed. All right. Enter one of the greatest spies of World War II. So Scott, I know that you did your National History Day documentary on this guy. Do you want to say anything about him before I launch into this at all, or not?
No, you got it.
No? Okay. All right. I just wanted to give you the opportunity, because you did a really good job explaining his whole life story and kind of like why he is so important. But this is essentially probably the closest character in World War II that you could basically say is like James Bond. Okay. Like, he is highly intelligent, highly capable in so many ways. But he actually was ethnically German. Okay, so he is going to be posing as a Nazi throughout the entire war. But because he is a dedicated communist, he and his family, basically kind of going back generations, were big believers in communism. He is going to be secretly working for Russia the entire time. So he becomes a very valuable Russian asset. And Russia will end up ordering him to get himself into Japan. Okay, so this was, part of their operation to keep tabs on that fascist country on the other side of Russia, just to see what they're going to do, because they're worried that they're going to get attacked on both sides. And so he's out in Russia, and basically, he is like a one-man intelligence agency. Like, not only does he develop the assets and gather the intelligence, but then he analyzes it and breaks it down and sends it all to Moscow, basically by himself. He's highly intelligent, has like a whole library of books, knows like a bunch of languages, etc. And in his kind of one-man spy agency operation, he is able to get a critical piece of intelligence. Okay. Where is Japan focused on right now? Like, we all know this because we talked about it just a minute ago, but Nobody else really knows it yet, except for the Japanese high command. What area of the world, Eiley, is Japan focusing on? Where are they going to go next, so to speak? You cut out. So can you say it again?
Is it Russia?
Well, think about it. We were just talking about this a minute ago. Ethan, did you want to add in a guess as well?
Yeah, it was basically all oil-bearing countries in the Pacific.
The Pacific, yes, and the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. There's actually oil there, so they're focusing in on that area, and so essentially, the critical piece of intelligence that Sorge will get is that Japan is not planning on helping the Nazis by attacking Russia on the other side, which again was kind of part of the original plan, so to speak. But because Japan is facing the existential threat of running out of gasoline, their eyes are elsewhere. And so he gets that critical piece of intel to Moscow just as the Nazis are closing in on the capital city. And of course, later he will get captured by the Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai. They will torture him. And Stalin will actually have a chance to do a spy trade for him and free him. But because he is so paranoid and doesn't even trust his own people, he won't trade for him. And Sorge will die in Japanese custody later. But before he gets captured, he gets this critical piece of intelligence to Stalin. And Stalin at this point is in desperation mode. Now, he had brought a commander from Siberia, which was so far out there on the far eastern side of Russia that in the purges, some of the officers way out in Siberia had escaped being purged. And one of those was a Russian general by the name of Georgy Zhukov. And Georgy Zhukov basically had been recalled a little bit earlier and had been very instrumental in kind of the defense of Leningrad. But Stalin now calls him down to the capital because he proved that he actually knew what he was doing. And that's why Russian resistance around Leningrad was so stubborn. And so he brings him down to Moscow. And in the defense of Moscow, this is really the critical moment of World War II. If this had gone the other way, Hitler would have won. Yes, Scott, go ahead.
So you're telling me Stalin wanted to kill this guy, and then he wants him to fight and help him?
Yeah, actually, Zhukov would carry a little briefcase around with him in the 1930s, which had all of his personal effects. And basically, he was expecting to get purged. Like he was just like, it's going to happen at some point, so I have all my stuff ready. I'm ready when it happens. And it never happened because he was out there in like such an obscure area that, it just wasn't, a thing. But he had been in charge of some Russian troops, the Siberian regiments, which were basically very effective in fighting in winter conditions. And they had been stationed in an area where they thought the Japanese might attack. So while Zhukov is being recalled to Moscow, he's getting this message from Sorge that Japan's not going to attack Russia. So Stalin takes a big chance. On the advice of Zhukov, he recalls the Siberian regiments. They put them on trains and they bring them all the way across Russia. And as the Nazis are closing in on the suburbs of Moscow, and as winter is really setting in, and like they get like a deep freeze where it gets to like -30 something below zero, and the oil is freezing in the engines of the tanks, and German guns won't fire, and the German troops just don't have like good enough coats or anything. So they have to do like a coat drive in Germany for German soldiers. But as the grip of winter sets in, the Siberian regiments are entering Moscow. And so again, this is such a dramatic moment. Yes, Isla, go ahead.
Okay, so this is kind of off topic, but it's on topic at the same time.
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
So when I think it was like 7th or 8th grade. I'm in the middle. Hold on.
Eiley, are you there?
Yeah, hold on. My brother was interrupting me. Okay, sorry. In like 7th or 8th grade for either honor band or mid-state, I don't remember which one, but we had this song we played called Moscow 1941, and it basically like recalled the events of the defense of Moscow, but through music.
Okay.
And like as they started like to defend it and beat the Nazis back, like the parts of the song would mix like for showing the desperation. The tempo was like picking up, and like the chills I got from that song.
Wow.
This is my favorite part of World War II because it was so good.
So you know about this because everybody like when I
yeah.
talk to people like and I'll ask this of students every year. They're like, I'm like, what's the turning point in World War II? And they're always like, D-Day. The Nazis were winning until the Americans stormed the beaches. And actually, that's not true.
It's
really,
the defense of Moscow.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just like basically where the Nazis could have had it all, and they get kind of stopped. But we haven't gotten to like the turning point where they start losing. But really, most of what will decide World War II in Europe is on the Eastern Front. It's in Russia. So yes, okay. So anyway, I want to jump over and I want to play this because this is again one of those moments in history. It's like this is footage you need to see. So here is a little bit on the defense of Moscow.
But while Hitler plotted his final attack on Moscow, Zhukov too planned an attack. But with what? He had already withdrawn as many troops as he dared from other sectors to defend Moscow. But there was one reserve the Russians had not yet touched, nor ever thought they would be able to. The 40 divisions of the Siberian Front, among the best troops in Russia, trained to fight in winter conditions. Since June, they had been expecting a Japanese attack. Midway through October, Stalin's master spy in Tokyo reported Japan's eyes were elsewhere. This time,
Sorge.
Stalin believed his spies. He moved the Siberian divisions to Moscow. Even at this moment of crisis, Moscow took time off to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution. And Stalin showed himself to his people.
We could say, in spite of all his shortcomings, that Stalin rendered a very great service to the USSR by that presence, because it showed two things. One, the Supreme Commander did not run away. Secondly, Stalin retained his nerve. That sense of nerve spread at once into all the armed forces. All the commanders began saying, Stalin himself is here.
Okay. And in this speech, it's in Russian. You see, you can't understand it, but he says, fight for Mother Russia. So in spite of all of his shortcomings as a person and as a leader, Stalin does the right thing here. Number one, like you just heard, he stays in Moscow. He doesn't flee like a lot of people would. And this is the big moment. Everybody kind of has that sense that if they don't win here, if they don't defend their capital, it's over. They're all going to become slaves. They're all going to die. Like this is for the nation, for the survival of the nation. They have to win. And they're going up against an army that really has never been beaten on land. So the scariest army in the world is bearing down on their capital, and they must win. So Stalin inspires his people to fight. And so here you go.
The ground had hardened. The panzers were able to roll again. On November the 26th, they entered Istra, just 30 miles west of Moscow. 4 days later, had taken Krasnaya Polyana, just 25 miles north. As yet, Zhukov had not used his Siberians, and German intelligence had not stumbled on the presence near Moscow of such numbers of fresh troops. The Germans were having troubles of their own.
And one morning, it was finished with this. All was frozen. And the cars was sitting in the mud, frozen, and the tanks could not roll. And in this moment, my heart broke down. And there was in a distance a large town. And I think that was the first time and the last time I have seen Moscow.
All right, I'm going to skip ahead here.
As it became colder, along the snow walls, to find the way during.
At first, did not want to conceive that this crisis was the end of all his strategical planning. But the army knew it better, and the Russians did the most important part in convincing Hitler too that the Russian campaign of this first year had failed and had come to an end.
December the 6th. With the Wehrmacht's morale at its lowest, although some German troops were just 15 miles from the Kremlin, Zhukov unleashed his Siberians.
It was astonishing. This time, the first time I saw the Russian tanks, 34, running through the fields and through the snow. Our own tanks couldn't shoot because it was too cold.
When I wanted to go back, I met Russians everywhere, and so this was the first impression that there was no victory anymore.
Notice how horses are even very effective when it's this cold. So I don't know if that music was the music you were referring to, but that essentially is, I was just referring that to Eiley there, but that essentially is kind of the first time that the Nazis get stopped. And it's basically where a combination of two things: the incredible cold temperatures, which were like making it so like their tanks wouldn't move, their guns wouldn't fire, and Zhukov hitting them with the Siberians, basically forced them back from the outskirts of Moscow. And so when things settle down after the attack is over, and the Nazis have been stopped for the first time ever, from getting an objective on land, the Russians have a short breather. Okay, and this is the kind of the dire situation that they are in. They have an army which is in bad need of an upgrade. And when everything thaws out, the Nazis are sitting right there in front of their capital. So here's why I feel like Georgy Zhukov deserves the credit for being probably the greatest general of World War II. Georgy Zhukov recognizes that all of the tactics that the Nazis are employing, the Blitzkrieg tactics, are essentially the best tactics. Like, he's like, if I were going to do things, this is how I would do them. Like he's like, just this military textbook from World War I, just throw it out. And so he's like, we need tanks, we need planes, we need everything we can get our hands on. And because Russia had suddenly been thrust into the Allies by being attacked by the Nazis, you know, like now the Allies were Britain and Russia and China. America was like sending them as much material as we could. We were sending it up to Archangel, which was a northern port in the White Sea, up in the Arctic Circle, and then we were also sending it through Iran because there had been a British and Russian kind of takeover of Iran, and we were using the railroads across Iran to supply Russia that way. But Zhukov is like saying to Russia, to Stalin, look, if you want to survive, every factory in Russia needs to be making tanks right now, like, and planes. And so like they convert, like they're moving factories backwards, you know, to keep them away from, you know, the Nazis getting control. They're setting them up, and they're just this is all out survival mode. Like they are producing tanks and planes as fast as they possibly can. And what Zhukov is going to try to do, and the problem is it's going to take time, is he is going to turn the Russian army, which was the laughing stock of Europe in 1940, into a copy of the Nazi army. Like everything's pretty much the same. Panzer divisions for the Nazis, tank divisions for the Russians. You know, planes, strategic bombing, planes, strategic bombing. You know, like they're going to have an air force, they're going to have panzers, everything the Nazis have, which are giving them success, the Russians are going to have them too. The thing is, during 1942, somehow they've got to hold on. They've got to survive long enough to catch up. Now, what advantage will they have when they finally do catch up? When they finally do get their army to kind of the same level, they're going to have a big advantage. Ethan, what is the big advantage?
Well, if they're equal on machine power, then they'll have like the upper hand on manpower.
Very good. Yes. Okay. So Nathan, is that what you were going to say too?
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, the machine, you know, power is the reason why the Nazis are doing so well. Yes, Scott, go ahead.
How much oil does the Soviet Union have? Because I know the Nazis were kind of struggling with it.
They're still able to produce a lot even today from the Caucasus region. As a matter of fact, Europe relies heavily on Russian oil. So it props up their economy through most of the Cold War. And even today, it is still like they're one of the world's big exporters of oil. So they have a lot like that region, the Caucasus region, has a lot of oil in it. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many million barrels off the top of my head, but it's very significant. So you gotta give Zhukov the credit though. Like he recognizes. So like Stalin had killed almost all of his good generals, but because he was way out in Siberia, Zhukov had escaped the purges, and now Stalin was just trusting him, and he was like, what do we need to do? And Zhukov was like, this is what we must do if we want to survive. So that leads us to one of the great conundrums of history. Okay, one of the great mysteries. The mystery is, how in the world does Russia hold on during 1942 when everything thaws out and they still have such a massive disadvantage in terms of just sheer numbers of tanks, sheer numbers of airplanes, etc. And the answer lies with the greatest spy of World War II. And I know I said Sorge was amazing. He was like the one-man spy agency. He's the closest guy. He's the equivalent of James Bond, right? He doesn't produce as much good intelligence as this guy. This is Rudolf Rösler. And Rudolf Rösler is a clerk in a Swiss bookstore, like a Catholic bookstore in Lucerne in Switzerland. And basically, if he tried to even run up a hill, he would like have an asthma attack and fall over. He's not a James Bond type figure. But you know how Sorge worked and worked and worked and finally got that one critical piece of intel to Stalin that was like, you know, the solid gold intel that Stalin needed at just the right moment. For whatever reason, we're still trying to figure this out. Rudolf Rosler, whose code name is Lucy, by the way, because he's from the city of Lucerne, gives Stalin basically what Hitler's going to do next on almost a daily basis. Like, it's like he has somebody in Hitler's planning room, in this conference room, they call it the Wolfslayer, that is like literally just like, okay, yeah, we just talked about moving this many tanks to this spot and attacking at exactly this point. Like, and so from 41, but especially into 42, until the Gestapo finally puts enough pressure on Swiss authorities to shut him down in 43. But really 42 is the window. It's the critical year. Rudolf Rosler is essentially telling telling Moscow exactly what the Nazis are going to do next every single time. So here's what Zhukov does. Zhukov takes the stuff he has, whether he's getting it from the Americans or he's getting it from his own factories, and he concentrates it on the spots that Lucy says are going to be attacked by the Nazis. So if he just spread all his stuff out and was like, okay, wherever they attack, we're ready for them, he would have been hammered. Like, the Nazis would have taken Moscow in 42. It would have been over. But basically, what's going to happen here? Now, Hitler is going to make some decisions too. He's going to focus some of his extra panzers elsewhere, etc. But basically, one of the reasons why the Russians are able to hold on is because of the critical intelligence that he is providing them. They're able to take what little they have and focus it right at the points of attack. And like, the Nazis are like, what the heck happened to Russia? Like, why are they suddenly like smart? And every time we try to do an attack, especially around Moscow, we keep running into a bunch of their tanks. Like, what the heck's going on here? So I see some questions here. Scott, I think you were first. Go ahead.
How did the Nazis not catch on to this? Like,
well, they don't.
All of a sudden,
it's in code. Okay, so the messages are in code. They know that there is somebody transmitting out of Switzerland. There's actually 3 people transmitting out of Switzerland. They call them Die Rote Drei, or the Red 3. But they didn't know like what was in the messages. But since Lucy is always right about everything all the time, like Moscow just begins to rely on him, and they're just like they don't understand, because they have no respect for the the Russians, because of how much success they had so far. So they just don't understand why suddenly the resistance is so stubborn. Nick, go ahead. What were you going to say?
How did he get all this intel in the first place?
That's the $1 million question. That's the question we're still arguing about to this day. And I'm actually going to give you both sides of this. Kenzie, go ahead. What was your question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask him the same thing. I was gonna ask, where was he getting this information from? If he was like such a, like, first of all, his asthma, and second of all,
right,
like, he was a clerk.
He's just sitting there in a bookstore, right? It's like, how is he getting this? Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor to theories from you guys before I tell you the 2 leading theories. And I'll tell you which one I think is probably the more right one. But anybody have a theory? Braden, go ahead.
This dude definitely somehow got like a wiretap or something. Like, in the Nazi room where they discussed all of this.
Okay.
Or like he had some regular customer that like was somehow connected to it, that was just like, oh yeah, the Nazis are doing all this and this, and
Okay, but I mean, that's top secret info. Okay, so you're saying that somebody, like, either he's got some kind of way of listening in on what they're saying in the Wolfslayer, or somebody who is in the Wolfslayer is committing high treason almost every day. Okay, Eiley, what's your theory?
Okay, hear me out. So
All right.
he's an alien with secret superpowers. He's been teleporting to those meetings while being invisible,
Yes.
listening in, and then teleporting to Moscow and letting them know everything.
Okay. All right.
That's it. That's my final answer.
Alien. Okay. Hey, and History Channel would agree with you since aliens are all they talk about now. Ethan, go ahead.
Okay. So, my theory is that this dude somehow drugged Hitler.
Okay, and Hitler himself is just like, in a delirium, and he's like, yeah, we're gonna go do this and this and this. All right, Faith, I think you were next. Go ahead.
I feel like he had a mole who was actually doing all of the spy work, like
Okay.
behind the scenes. And then instead of the spy who was actually like doing all the stuff reporting, because I guess like that would be a lot more dangerous because if they found out that that dude was reporting, obviously they'd kill him. But instead he was reporting to Lucy, and Lucy was the one who was actually getting the intelligence to the higher ups in Russia.
Okay, all right. Okay, you're actually basically like that is one of the main theories actually. Zach.
Oh wait, really?
It is one of the main theories. Go ahead, Zach.
So I was thinking that it's probably like all the quote unquote vitamin shots he's been getting. And there's so many just crazy drugs. He's probably not being observant enough to see that these things are happening. Like that there's a mole.
Okay, all right. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I like the idea that someone in the planning room, like he's just that nice and is a regular at his sweet little bookstore. So he goes to buy his books. And he's like, "Yeah, this is what we're gonna do next." Blah blah blah. I like to think that he just seemed that unassuming.
Okay, all right. And Kenzie, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna agree kind of with what Elizabeth and Braden were saying, that like he had this cover as a bookstore guy. Like he was the bookstore guy.
Yeah.
And it was perfect because somebody could have been telling him everything because they're like a Hess who is like very not the smartest, but they weren't so loyal. So that was like the only difference. But somebody like a Hess was telling him these things.
Okay, all right. So all of you had some good ideas there, even the ones that were a little crazy. I like them. But I'm going to tell you the two theories, okay? Now, because this guy is literally like nobody has ever pulled off what he did ever, like in the history of espionage ever again. Usually spies work and work and work, and they work their sources, and they get one really good piece of intelligence or a couple of really good pieces. They pass them on. That's about as much as you can get out of even the best spies. Nobody has ever passed this much top level, solid gold information, that consistency, that long. Nobody's ever done it except for him. Okay, so I see hands from Zach and Elizabeth. Do you guys just forget to put them down, or do you guys have something you wanted to add?
I forgot to put it down.
Okay, all right. So the first theory is the theory that Faith and some other people had basically, I think Kenzie and some others had said, which was he's getting intel from somebody in Hitler's top circle. But just remember, and this is, by the way, the CIA did a giant study of this. They did a study on Lucy, which you can find. I've had people do National History Day projects on this, and they've found the big giant CIA report and used it as a source. But essentially, the argument is that that Lucy is getting high-level information from a group of people in Hitler's top circle. Now, that makes sense because really those are the only people who know. Like they're the only people who know. But here are the things against that theory. The first thing against that theory is that, first of all, these people would be causing their own country to lose against Russia, which like even people who don't like Hitler still love their country and don't want them to lose the war. All right. So they would have to have some motivation. Yes, Kenzie, what were we going to say?
With what you were saying about how they wouldn't want their country to lose the war, I think they were like the person who may have been telling him, who may have been like a regular customer, may have been giving him this intel thinking, oh, he's a bookstore clerk. He's not going to tell anyone.
Okay. All right. And Zach, go ahead.
Could it have been likely that it was the people that he had taken over to get into power, like the people who he had been like, hey, you need to do what I say or else you're dead.
There are people who
Could
don't
it have
like
been
him.
those people?
There are people who don't like him, but they're kind of quiet while Germany's winning. But when Germany starts losing, they're going to try to kill Hitler. They're called the Kreisau Circle. We'll talk about them. So you are right. There are people. So again, the CIA kind of goes down that road. They're saying there are people, top people, who are like, they don't like Hitler and they don't like the road that Hitler's taking Germany down. So, and Ethan, what were you going to say?
Could it been like some of the fragments of that communist revolution that happened in Germany?
Okay. And again, Sorge is one of those people who is like, kind of a dedicated communist. Like, is it just because people are diehard believers in communists? That's a great theory as well. So the CIA basically kind of goes down that road. Okay. But remember, these are top generals, people who've been in the German military forever. Okay. They're vetted by the military, etc. Here's the other big problem with the CIA's theory. And that is, how is the information getting transmitted? So like Elizabeth, you were saying that he's going to the bookstore. The person would have to travel out of Germany into Switzerland on almost a daily basis. The Gestapo would immediately be suspicious of anybody who tried to do that, and nobody did. And so the only other way to get the information to Lucy was via radio. And that is actually how Lucy, because he was later asked, where were you getting your intel from? And he was saying, I had a source in Germany codenamed Walther, Walther. And he was basically the one giving me this intel, which I was then relaying to Moscow. The problem is that every radio source that had been short burst transmitting out of Germany, was tracked down by the Gestapo. So the Gestapo literally had tracked down, by 42, they had broken down most of the Red Orchestra and completely destroyed it. And they even got Liebe Dome into custody, like with that triangulation thing we talked about. They had there were no radios that were transmitting out of Germany to Roessler. So this leads me to my favorite theory, which is in this book right here, which is it's called Spies by Ernest Volkmann, The Secret Agents Who Changed the Course of History. It's like, if you like history books and espionage, I would grab a copy of this off of Amazon. It's like $3 or something for a used copy, but it's amazing. It's got a lot of really good behind the scenes stories that are like nobody knows about. And in this book, he's wrestling. He has a whole chapter on Lucy, and he's wrestling with this same conundrum. Is like, where is he getting this intel, which is keeping Russia in the fight? And his answer is the British. Why would the British be the source of all of this great intel? Like, anyone, go ahead, Ethan.
Because of the decrypting machines and and also like MI6 and all that.
Yes, Operation Ultra. And MI6 had been taken over by a guy named Claude Danzy, who was very kind of practical, very capable guy. He makes the argument that the British, who, if they tried to share this stuff directly with Stalin never would have trusted it, because Stalin is so paranoid, he doesn't even trust his own spies. But they were basically pretending to be a source from Russia, and they were feeding this information to Lucy, and Lucy was then feeding it to Moscow. Now, the other big support for this theory is, after World War II is over, during the Cold War, wow, that was some thunder, the Czechs will actually hire Roessler because of his just legendary status as a spy, and he won't produce anything. He'll be terrible. So the other big kind of support for this is that after World War II, he's nothing special. So I lean towards Volkmann's way of looking at it, because I feel like it was too risky, too hard, and too difficult for someone to get that great of intel to Lucy on such a regular basis, that really the only people who could have done it would be the British, because they're the only other people who knew what the Nazis were saying. But anyway, that is another one of the reasons why Operation Ultra is so critical. Like without Operation Ultra, without that intel going to Lucy to Moscow, the Russians just would have been overwhelmed in 42. Yeah, Olivia, go ahead.
What exactly does it mean when it says when Swiss authorities shut him down? Did they like kill him or put him in prison or
no,
what?
they basically forced him to stop transmitting. And they took his radio from him. But essentially the Gestapo who were under Heinrich Müller, remember, like one of the most gifted detectives in pretty much all of history. Like you know, his police force was amazing. The Gestapo are legendary, and they were worried about these transmissions that were coming out of Switzerland. And so they're like, well, we don't know if they're transmitting stuff that is like useless or if they're transmitting good stuff, but you know, for whatever reason, the Russians seem to be doing well. So they just leaned on the Swiss authorities. They're like, look, you don't want to be invaded right now, do you? You know, like, well, we need you to do something for us, and you need to shut these guys down. And so the Red Three, Die Rote Drei, all three of the radio sources coming out of Switzerland were shut down. Two of them weren't giving much, you know, intel of worth, but the third one, Lucy, was of course the critical one, but nobody really knew because it was all coded. So anyway, that is the great mystery of how does Russia survive long enough to basically copy the Nazi army and turn the Red Army from the worst army in Europe to the scariest army in the world. So they're in that process. Just be aware of that as we talk about other events going on in 42. Also, in the United States, there was a massive spy ring that was a Nazi spy ring, and that guy we talked about earlier, Intrepid, basically helped America uncover this, and so basically, one of the spies, William Siebold, who had been forced to spy by the Gestapo, essentially became a double agent, and he began feeding the Gestapo bad information and uncovered like a whole bunch of other people who were part of this big spy ring in the United States. And so they were all arrested by the FBI and went to prison. So that is the Duquesne spy ring. And that takes us to another critical development. In 1941, President Roosevelt authorized the American nuclear weapons program, which became known as the Manhattan Project. And that was because he had received a letter earlier from Albert Einstein, who I think I mentioned this in one of the classes, but he had actually in the 1930s kind of seen the writing on the wall of what was going to happen to the Jews in Germany. He was a Jewish German, and he, as a visiting professor, was lecturing in the United States, and he just decided not to go back. Like, so he had been in the United States ever since the 30s. He and a fellow scientist named Leo Szilard knew that top scientists in Germany, like under the Nobel Prize winning scientist Werner Heisenberg, were working on a Nazi version of the nuclear weapons program. And so they wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, and they said, look, if they get this weapon, it will be absolutely devastating. Like it's a game changer. So in the interest of them not being the only ones having one, we're telling you that you probably should work on one too, even though this greatly pained Einstein, because he never wanted his theories to be used to kill people, to create weapons like this. But they spread out the laboratory. They didn't want it all in one place, so it couldn't like be bombed and wiped out or anything, and it would be much harder to spy upon. And so they spread it out in laboratories all across America, the most important of which were Los Alamos in the desert of New Mexico, and Oak Ridge in Tennessee, which some of you may be familiar with, is still a big government, research facility. And the labs underneath some tennis courts or some squash courts in Chicago at one of the universities there. And that would later become Fermi National Laboratories. But because we were the repository for many of the world's greatest scientists who had fled Europe, because many of them had come here, we're actually going to end up leapfrogging the German program, and we're going to get to the bomb first, even though we start 2 years later than them. Let me ask this question. Why do we have all the best scientists? Why did many of the greatest scientific minds of Europe come here? Oh boy, whole bunch of hands. I'll pick someone who hasn't said a lot. Braden, go ahead.
Are they Jewish?
A lot of them are Jewish. Very good. Okay. So, Faith, did you want to add anything else to that?
I didn't think that it was because they were Jewish. I just thought that, like, in Europe, like, they would be forced to do things that
they didn't want to
wouldn't
do.
want to do
There is
because
some
the
of that
Nazis
too.
would
There is. That's much more on the
Yeah.
minor side, but many of them, yeah, most of it is because a lot of them do have Jewish blood. And so Enrico Fermi, who is actually from Italy, who had fled to the United States, ended up becoming the first scientist to get a chain reaction going. And essentially the way a nuclear fission chain reaction works is you have a pile of uranium and you put it in a neutron rich substance like heavy water, and you fire neutrons in there hoping that you're going to hit some nuclei, and those nuclei are big and unstable, and when they split apart, there's a release an enormous amount of energy, but they also shoot protons and neutrons in all directions, which can then hit other nuclei and kind of cause a chain reaction where you have a whole bunch of nuclei being split and huge amounts of energy being released. Nathan, go ahead. Nathan Dark.
Would another reason be because wasn't America still having like a population boom from immigration because of the world wars?
Okay, well, as we get further in, like when we get like closer and closer to World War II breaking out, and as the Holocaust really picks up, the Nazis are going to shut down immigration from Germany. Like there's a lot of Jews who try to flee and they won't let them. And then there's like, and the United States actually gets kind of anti-Jewish in its immigration policies. Like there's a group of people on this ship called the St. Louis, and they're all Jewish, and they've basically gotten out of Nazi Germany, and they're trying to get into the United States, and the United States refuses to let them like come into America because of kind of like the isolationist feeling of the time, and you know there's a significant amount of anti-Semitism even in the United States, and so they end up actually going all the way back to Germany and disembarking there, and of course then you know the German authorities are able to deport them, but yeah, I mean, so I don't know if that completely answers your question or not, but Germany actually is restricting immigration flows. Yes, there are other people immigrating to the United States, but this isn't one of those big wave moments where there's like tons of people. That was more like late 1800s, early 1900s. And then Ethan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was like the main thing that did the chain reaction sustain was the reflector plates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was I think what was it? Elements start with a B, I think, something.
Yeah. I vaguely remember that, but like I know it was
but
yeah.
it
Go ahead.
was basically neutron reflector plates where instead of just absorbing neutrons, it would reflect neutrons back into the chamber.
Right. Yeah.
But and also I think it was a combination of a reflector and a slowdown, because if the neutrons were too fast, they would have a less likely probability of hitting anything, so it actually slow down neutrons so they could actually hit other nuclei.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so essentially, the Americans are going to get there first, and we're going to talk about it when we get to 1945. But here's the thing, and this just makes me laugh. If Hitler hadn't been such a racist jerk, he would have had the world's greatest weapon, because those scientists never would have left Germany, and he would have had them. And instead they fled to the United States, and we got them. I mean, some went to Britain as well, but a lot of them fled here. And so it's because of his own racism that the game-changing weapon that would have like given him victory in World War II is not his, even though his guys start on it 2 years prior to America. So I just love that little bit of karma there. So that's the Manhattan Project. And in October of 1941, General Tojo becomes, as I mentioned before, becomes the new prime minister of Japan. And this guy is, and he's very much a militarist. And he is a no nonsense kind of person. Like, he is like, okay, we have X, Y, and Z as our objectives. Shortest road to X, shortest road to Y, shortest road to Z, And so he says, I am setting a personal deadline of November 29th, 1941. If we do not have an agreement by that time from the United States to lift the economic sanctions, we're going to hit them. And of course, that means they'll bring the US into the war, etc. But he gives Admiral Yamamoto the green light when that deadline passes. And he says, I want you to cripple their entire Pacific fleet to the point where they're no longer a threat. And so that, of course, is going to lead to one of the big moments in American history.
Can I just explain real quick of the idea of why they, are you going to go into why they did Pearl Harbor?
You're going to talk about like why they attacked when the battleships were all there and everything, like why they waited until like the moment when most of those ships are there. Is that what you're looking at?
No, it's like specifically in like choosing of basically to wipe out the entire Navy. It's like, oh, but if America can produce so much, why would that be a problem? Well, I think it was because specifically at the time, the only United States shipyards at the time that produced ships for the U.S. Navy was on the eastern coast, and they had to go all the way through the Panama Canal, all the way down to like, then to Hawaii. It would take like weeks before they could actually roll out.
In Norfolk. Yeah. Okay, that's actually, I like that theory there. But essentially, yeah, they're trying to basically, and also if we are down like a huge number of ships compared to them, they're always going to be able to stay ahead of us. They're always going to have a head start, so to speak. So, and Jacob, did you have a question or something you wanted to say? I saw your hand there real quick.
No, I accidentally raised it.
All right. So essentially, this is like such a big moment in history that I am going to play you a little clip thing out of the movie Pearl Harbor, because Hollywood, obviously is going to like, kind of butcher history a little bit when they make movies, but they are masters of drama. Okay. And so this is kind of a little bit of the attack. And as you see the attack happening, I'll tell you about certain important ships getting hit and things like that. So let me play you just a little bit out of the Pearl Harbor movie. And of course, they kind of skip along here, and they don't have all the extra stuff that's in the movie that has to do with the various relationships in it. So here is the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The carriers have been unnoticed in the ocean. They've come close to Pearl Harbor, and now they're launching the surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. All of our ships are just sitting there like ducks in a row. All right, and notice how they had the wooden fins on the back of the torpedoes. One of the problems they knew they'd have with dropping these torpedoes in the water with planes is that the torpedoes would sink too far down, because Pearl Harbor was a very shallow harbor. And so the innovation was to put these wooden fins on them to keep them kind of from sinking too far down. It was very effective. Okay, this bombardier from the high altitude bomber is going to drop a bomb on the USS Arizona. Here it goes. Like a perfect hit. So what it does is it hits the USS Arizona right in the magazine, right in the area where all the ammunition is kept. So when that bomb blows up, it blows up all the ammunition and it literally tears the ship in half. And both halves of the ship sink very quickly into the bottom of the harbor. And they're still there, by the way. There's a memorial there. This is Oklahoma right here. Dive bombers, very effective. All right. So, and they do attack the airfields, but that was the picture I wanted you to see right there. And so let me jump back over to the slide. This basically is a 2-hour-long attack. And in that attack, they sink 5 battleships and severely damage 3 others. And they sink 13 other, that's supposed to be cruisers, not carriers, cruisers and destroyers, effectively wiping out almost all of our Pacific fleet. Now, critical thing, one of the new kinds of ships that had been developed since World War I, which they were actually using to mount this attack, was not there. We had 4 of them, and they were not there. Does anybody know what kind of ship was not present at Pearl Harbor that is actually going to turn out to be even better than battleships in big naval battles? Nobody knows it yet. We haven't had one.
Was it the aircraft carriers? Was it the Lexington or was the Lexington later?
Are you talking about, is that one of the aircraft carriers that
was out?
Yeah, that one was out at sea along with the other ones. Yeah. Jacob, did you have anything to add to that?
Didn't they also like not hit the repair yards or the submarine base?
Yes, you are.
And
correct.
the oil field and the fuel and the storage and the fuel storage fields.
Fuel storage as well. Yeah.
But they didn't take out the things that supported the fleet. They just took out the fleet.
Yeah. And remember, they only had so much ammunition that they could carry with them. Remember, they're like these dive bomber planes can only carry one big bomb. Or one torpedo, etc., which they have to effectively use. But yeah, and they will hit our airfields and they will try to destroy our planes on the ground on the airfields. But you know, some of our planes will get up there and will shoot back and shoot down.
Yeah. Can I mention a little conspiracy theory?
Yes, go ahead.
So apparently, there's a conspiracy that goes on with like a bunch of older generations, is that specifically they believe that Pearl Harbor was staged and that Roosevelt was in on it, and that Roosevelt actually put out the aircraft carriers into sea before then, saying like in a weird plan to try and kick up the economy for some reason, basically collaborated with Japan. I don't know, it's weird.
Yeah,
mainly people who just hated Roosevelt.
I don't really buy that, but yeah. But anyway, Jacob, did you have anything else, or did you forget to put your hand up?
Yeah, then after Pearl Harbor, I think there's the aircraft carriers out in the Pacific were told, and they tried to strike back at the Japanese fleet, but they went the wrong direction.
Okay,
they went like south instead of north.
Right, but then there is a raid that is done off of an aircraft carrier called the Doolittle raid, and so the Doolittle raid.
Yes.
Yeah,
that was one of my favorite parts of World War II.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor, right? And it's in the movie Pearl Harbor, and of course they make a huge deal out of it. But Basically, we send an aircraft carrier way out into the middle of the Pacific, and we launch some bombers off of it, which was kind of hard to do. And those bombers will fly over the home islands of Japan and drop bombs on Tokyo and we put all the little friendship medals that they had given us, while we were, doing the diplomacy. We tied those to the bombs, and that was our way of kind of like responding to Pearl Harbor, But basically, this is a catastrophic loss for us. Like, it is absolutely catastrophic. Somewhere close to 3,000 Americans, are killed. I think it's 2,400, but and of course, the neutrality acts are over with. Like, this is, America's in the war. The whole country feels like we've just been hitting it's like being in a fight and getting punched right in the nose. Like, it's like the whole country is just reeling, and they're just like, what? They hit us. And so, yeah, we're going to war. And so we are in, okay. And I'm going to play you a little bit of Roosevelt's speech, because of course that's another big moment in history. But simultaneous to what is happening here, Yamamoto also attacks the British fleet in the Pacific at Singapore in a very similar attack in style to the Pearl Harbor attack, wipes out the entire British fleet in Singapore. And so then the Japanese forces blitz all of the islands in kind of like this big swath of the Pacific, and just get control over all of them. Now, Hawaii, of course, is too far for them to get like manpower, like enough manpower to like actually put boots on the ground. But literally, the only thing we have left that prevents them from invading the coast of California or taking out Hawaii are the aircraft carriers, and that's about it. Yes, Ethan.
Yeah, isn't the consensus is that basically the Japanese command put more importance over getting Singapore and the Philippines first, like, supply oil, than to completely wipe out?
Well, they were going for that oil supply. They were just wanting to take us out as a threat in the Pacific. But the British were also a threat. The British and the United States.
And I think it's like, when it comes to aircraft carriers, people say like, oh, they won the war, but submarines are like basically
Very
death
important.
sentences to aircraft carriers.
Yes, they're very important as well. Yeah. And again,
I think there was like Japanese submarines in the war with like an ever looming threat because of the long range. They nicknamed the Long Lance torpedoes.
Right. Yeah, and that, again, we could get into the minutia of this war, like, and we could just go on forever. But we're just trying to hit the highlights here. But yes, you are correct about that. And there was some inkling that this was going to happen from Operation Magic, which was an attempt by our code breakers to break the Japanese diplomatic code, the Purple Code, the one that had been previously broken under the American Black Chamber, Herbert Yardley. We talked about that. So that code had been partially broken, and they had like some indication that the Japanese were planning something, but they just didn't know where. Like everybody assumed, like, if they were going to attack us, they'd attack us in the Philippines, which is part of this big blitz. And we'll talk about it in just a minute. But really, Pearl Harbor is this just kind of like sucker punch, and it's just we're in shock. So here is President Roosevelt addressing Congress, and of course you're going to hear some very famous words here. So here it is.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
All right. So there you go. The immortal words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, basically bringing us fully into World War II. And again, we will discuss kind of how this all plays out. But this is going to lead to one of the most controversial executive orders in all of American history. Now, during wartime, presidents have extraordinary wartime powers. They can do things that normally they would never be able to do. We talked about this with Lincoln during the Civil War, suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And essentially, that's what President Roosevelt does again. But this time, it's on racial lines. And so, because the Japanese people were kind of famous for kind of considering themselves a family, even though they might be living in different countries all over the world, Japanese Americans were seen as a potential threat to the United States. And so even though many of them had proven themselves as American citizens, there had been a few spies here and there of Japanese descent that had aided the Japanese in the lead up to Pearl Harbor. And so it was decided that all Japanese people had to be put into concentration camps and interned. And so this is what we call Japanese internment. It's Executive Order 9066, and 110,000 Japanese American people were rounded up and put into internment camps all across the western half of the United States. Many of them, of course, were people who were totally loyal to the country and would never, betray America, but because of their racial descent, they were seen as potential problems. So Zach, go ahead. What were you going to say? Zach Vandenbosch?
So did they like just see any Asian person and then just assume they were Japanese and then they all just got hate for it?
No, like there are definite differences, like Korean Americans.
I meant like just the citizens.
Oh,
was there like racial prejudice against just Asians in general because of this?
And that actually goes along with something that we've talked about in the news recently. There's actually anti-Japanese cartoons that were drawn by Dr. Seuss. Remember how Dr. Seuss got canceled recently? And Walt Disney did them, and they really are incredibly racist in how they depict Asian people. They exaggerate their eyes and everything. So yes, the answer is there is an incredible amount of public backlash. So in many ways, this may have been helpful. I hate to say that though, because really, I mean, having your freedom and your property taken away from you and being thrown into an internment camp is no joke. But at least people were protected from being attacked. Again, all of it bad. Nathan, I think you were next. Nathan Dark.
Yes, I can see why you would think this was a good thing, I guess. But to me, it's weird that they did it we were at war with Germany and Italy too, and nothing happened to people from those countries.
Right.
Yeah. One of America's like founding ideas is like innocence until proven guilty, and so it's weird that they would throw an entire group of people into internment just because of the association with the country they're at war with. It's just weird to me.
Yeah, and most historians agree with you, Nathan. This is considered to be one of the worst abuses of civil rights in American history, because people are just being thrown in a camp because of their race, and it's not just men of fighting age; it's every man, woman, and child. Olivia, go ahead.
So, would you say that this was just driven by fear of all of the past events and what was going on?
And there were some Japanese Americans who did provide some intel to the Japanese, and of course the FBI tracked those people down. And there were some Operation Magic intercepts of Japanese purple messages, which talked about recruiting spies from the Japanese American population. So those were also reasons why it was done. Autumn, go ahead.
So kind of along the lines of what Nathan was saying, was there any discrimination against Germans and Italians?
There was actually. And again, that's another whole rabbit hole we could go down. And there's some really interesting kind of stories that come out of that. But Germans who were captured were actually brought over and worked in POW camps set up in the United States. And, they were hard workers and built a lot of things and whatnot. But they were treated pretty badly by the locals that were there in that area, and so there is like a lot of anti-German feeling as well. But they're German Americans are such a huge part of the population. There's no way they could have done this same sort of thing to them. Ethan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's like it. I don't think I see it in the slide, but it's like technically one of the worst parts isn't even the fact that they got into the internment camps. It's basically they lost all the rights to their previous property once they were put into the camps.
Yeah, they had their property confiscated.
Yeah, and like literally there are these what you would call the equivalent of carpetbaggers, but for Japanese Americans who bought up all their property for like a tenth of the price.
For pennies on the dollar. Yeah. And and that was, you're right, that was one of the worst parts of this, is many of them had built up businesses.
Yeah, I think it was like some data's like they lost a total of $23 billion worth of collective investment in property.
Yeah. Again, incredible abuse of human rights. And as Nathan is saying, this is like denying them their civil liberties. And of course, when you do that, people can sue. And so there are going to be some cases that are going to work their way up to the Supreme Court. So we're going to talk about the most famous of those cases, Korematsu, when we get to 1944. So it'll take a little while for it to work its way all the way through the court system, but we'll get to it in just a little bit. And then Faith, go ahead.
You said that they were kind of put in like internment or concentration camps. Was
Mhm.
this like as bad as what Germans were doing to the Jews? I imagine not, but
No, they were well fed, well clothed. There was no starvation. There was no purposeful
Okay.
starvation or anything like that. Like they had all necessities provided for them. It's just that they couldn't leave.
Okay, so they couldn't leave and they couldn't own anything really?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, but
that's
I think
terrible.
I think I found like one other thing. It's like, yeah, the general consensus is that they were treated better, but that doesn't mean they were treated right in
Yeah,
the
like,
facilities.
exactly.
Like, because they found it like a lot of the facilities, they had no plumbing whatsoever. Like,
Right, they built these things like really quickly. Yeah. So like they
yeah,
were,
it's like no plumbing. I think there was also like basically it's like no plumbing. Like in places where it's basically desert, it was like people had like heat strokes out because like there was almost no actual climate control.
yeah. Yeah, and there's like a whole rabbit hole we could go down about like what it was like in the camps, and there's books that have been written like Farewell to Manzanar and all this stuff, you know, like etc. But again, you know, we don't have the time, unfortunately. But yeah, that is kind of one of the worst kind of knee-jerk reactions in American history when it comes to, you know, race and violating people's civil liberties. All right. The taking of French Indochina was just a part of a Japanese plan to completely cut China off from the supplies, the lifeline of supplies that it was getting from British India. And so, as they basically kind of continued their land campaign through Southeast Asia, the Japanese take Thailand, and then they take the British colony of Burma. And Burma reaches all the way up to the Himalayas. Okay, so the kind of like the border goes all the way up there, and there was this supply line that went from India to China called the Burma Road. Well, that supply line was cut when the Japanese took Burma, and this opens up a brand new theater of World War II. It's called the China Burma India Theater, or the CBI Theater. And realizing that it was really important to keep China in the war, just as like it's really important to keep Russia in the war, to prevent the Japanese from taking the full force of their military elsewhere. The Allies started dedicating generals and men and equipment to this theater of the war. So basically, the Allies create a like a kind of a joint British-American force under General Joe Stilwell from the United States and General William Slim from the UK. And their main goal is going to be to retake Burma so they can reopen this supply line from India to China, because China, one of their biggest problems, one of Chiang Kai-shek's biggest problems, is lack of equipment. Like just like the Nazis had that advantage over the Russians, the Japanese had that advantage over the Chinese. And so getting them equipment was really, really important. And because China didn't really have an air force, prior actually to our entry into the war, President Roosevelt had authorized Claire Chennault, this guy right here, to assemble a group of pilots, volunteer pilots, to go over and essentially fight for China against the Japanese. And this group of fighters, this group of pilots, became known as the Flying Tigers. And you'll notice they have a very distinctive kind of artistry on their planes. What does that look like right there? The face of a what?
A shark.
Yeah, a shark. So if you've ever seen a plane that has that, that is where it originally.
Most nicknames, like a common nickname for like great fighters, was Sky Sharks.
Sky Sharks, yeah. And so basically, this is known as, is about 200 planes, and is known as the AVG, or the American Volunteer Group. And when Pearl Harbor was hit, the AVG got into it about 12 days later with the Japanese, as the Japanese were trying to invade Burma. But eventually Chennault was heavily outnumbered and was forced to retreat into China. once Burma fell. So the base of operations of the AVG becomes China itself. And the Flying Tigers do almost single-handedly stop some Japanese attacks with air power, especially the invasion of Chongqing, one of the cities in the interior of China that was really important for Chiang Kai-shek to hold on to. So this American pilot group became very, very important during the war for the Chinese. And General MacArthur was probably our best general that we had in terms of just aggressiveness and strategy, strategic thinking. And he was stationed in our most valuable colony, the Philippines. We put him there because we expected the fight to basically be in the Philippines. Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
Wasn't he also just a little bit like crazy in his tactics?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He'll want to start World War III in the Korean War, and he'll get fired for it. So
yeah, and then I was gonna say, didn't he want to drop another just a nuke on them?
He wanted to nuke Beijing, basically. And
granted, like the mood in the 50s was use a nuke for everything.
Right.
You can use it to build a canal. You can use it to destroy cities. You can use it to frickin' fish for some reason.
But I mean, yeah, Truman knew that once you go down that slippery slope, and he knew Russia wasn't going to just let us have China and let convert China back to a democracy. So he knew that was the slippery slope down to World War III. You had to keep it contained within the. So we'll get to all that. But yes, you are correct. He is a little on the kind of overly aggressive side, and also he's just kind of an egomaniac. But he's a great general. And so anyway, basically we have 110,000 troops in the Philippines. We have a lot of troops there, and they're just getting hit from all sides. When the Japanese do their blitz and see this giant kind of swath of the Pacific that they get control of, they're just getting hit from all sides. And so they get surrounded, they get pushed back, and eventually they get pushed all the way down to this little peninsula on one of the big islands, and it's called Corregidor. There's actually a little island on the very tip of this peninsula. It's near Manila, and it's on the Bataan Peninsula, by the way. And the Japanese basically surround them, and like as the Japanese are closing in, and it looks like it's pretty much hopeless for the American forces there. General MacArthur is ordered by Washington to evacuate to Australia. They don't want to lose General MacArthur, and so as he's kind of getting on the plane and getting ready to go, he turns to his men and he says, "I will return." And then, of course, he has this gift for being just a little theatrical. And so he gets on the plane and he's evacuated out, and they close in. And even though our guys put up one heck of a fight, they're forced to surrender. And when they do, the survivors are basically sent on this 60-mile march called the Bataan Death March, where 18,000 of them die due to really horrible mistreatment by the Japanese, which breaks all international conventions on how POWs are supposed to be treated. And then they're put into big internment camps inside the Philippines, like San Fernando and Capas. And of course, if you've seen movies like Unbroken, that's about, the experience of those POWs in those camps. So I want to just, in anticipation of what's coming next, if you're the Japanese and this is all the territory you now control, what would you go for next? Anybody looking at the map want to tell me what is the next place that is in serious danger? Ethan, go ahead.
Australia looking mighty tasty there.
Australia's got a ton of resources too.
Yeah, they have like coal, iron galore.
Every mineral you can possibly think of, just about. And so yeah, it's like Australia is a miner's dream. So Australia is in panic mode. They are freaking out, and they're begging for help because they know the Japanese are coming their way. And of course, the first place they look is Britain, because they're part of the British Commonwealth, and the British are like, we lost our Pacific fleet, and our Atlantic fleet is just barely keeping the sea lanes open to the whole island. We would love to help you, but we have no help to send. And so the only other power in the Pacific that could possibly help them against the Japanese is the Americans. And so they turn to us and they say, please help us. Now, if I'm going to roll back to, well, no, I got the map here. If we're going to retake any of this territory, if we're going to retake the Philippines, etc., or if we're going to mount a counterattack against Japan, it would be very nice to have Australia as a foothold to basically mount the attack from, because otherwise you have to come from all the way from Hawaii across, vast expanses of water in order to do anything. And so there is an advantage to having it, but really all we have left are our aircraft carriers of note anyway. And so if we lose those, we cannot stop the Japanese from invading the coast of California. Like that's how serious our situation is. So I want to put this up to anybody who wants to answer. If you were president, what would the smart move be? Like Australia has just called on you for help. You only have the aircraft carriers left. Is it better to hold them and kind of defend the coastline of California, and because that's all we've got left, or is it better to risk them and try to save Australia? Zach,
it's better to hold.
Did we get the nukes yet?
Nope, that's not until 45. We don't detonate. We don't.
Okay, well, we should still nuke Australia. If there's no ground for the Japanese to get, then we're fine. Just nuke Australia.
I mean, what's the difference? It's already all desert.
Yeah, well, the western half is, yeah. All right, Ethan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say probably the best decision is hold back until we got like more than 4 ships.
Yeah, right. Essentially, like that's the smart move. Faith, go ahead.
Can the Japanese like even attack us on the Pacific side? Like the Pacific Ocean is so big, and like we were barely able really to get across the Atlantic.
Well,
so,
I mean,
oh yeah, there's submarines like I think tested in data. They have just enough range to get near for like a strike on like the most western part of the coast.
What they would do?
It seems really, really like, I don't know, like trying to cross the entire Pacific to get to us at California seems like it would be like really hard.
No, what they would do is they would actually attack Hawaii, and they would take Hawaii over. They would turn it into a base of operations to attack from. So the first step in taking us out would be to attack Hawaii. Then from Hawaii, without any ships being able to defend us, they could, and really you can take aircraft carriers and you can steam them over to wherever you want. I mean, you can put them, like they brought them out to right north of Pearl Harbor and did a surprise attack there. And they are actually going to take 2 of the islands in the Aleutian island chain off the coast of Alaska, Attu and Kisku. So there is actually some American territory that is attacked and taken over by the Japanese.
Don't get me started on the story of those 2 islands. It's so sad. It's so
we can't go down that rabbit hole. I'm sorry, we just don't have time for it. But anyway, President Roosevelt and his top military people decide that they are going to defend Australia in spite of all the risks. And so basically the American aircraft carriers go into this sea north of Australia called the Coral Sea, and General MacArthur is put in charge of Australian forces with some American support that are basically going to try to fight off the Japanese as they try to come across Papua New Guinea and get control of Port Moresby, which was a capital city area that had airstrips on it, which then Japanese bombers could use those airstrips to start bombing Australian cities. And so they had to keep the Japanese from getting Port Moresby, and they had to keep the Japanese aircraft carriers and their Navy ships from basically getting to the coast of Australia. And so this is the first big surface fleet battle of World War II. And it's Japanese aircraft carriers versus American aircraft carriers. And it becomes very evident in this battle that if it's aircraft carriers versus battleships, the aircraft carriers will win every time, because there are some Japanese battleships that are like really ineffective in this battle, because really they're just effective in the range of their guns. Yes, Dylan, go ahead.
Did Australia have a big army?
They don't have a huge population, but they have a decent sized one. I mean, it's just not huge, and really, they're just afraid of the Japanese, because the Japanese have just been like absolutely flawlessly amazing so far in almost every attack they've done.
Was there any Australian Navy, or like what they call the Commonwealth Navy?
They did have some ships. They did have some
Yeah,
ships.
because I think I remember from this battle there's a cruiser called the Perth that was there.
Yeah, and it's named after one of their cities, like on the northern coast. Yeah. But basically, yes, they do have a small navy, but remember, they had relied on the British Navy in Singapore, kind of the British Pacific Fleet, for a lot of their protection that they needed. So since that's gone, they're relatively defenseless. So anyway, in this battle, the Japanese lost a small carrier, and the U.S. loses one of its big carriers, but the Japanese are unable to proceed any further, and so Australia keeps its freedom. And three of their large carriers are actually crippled, and they'll have to like repair them. But so essentially, even though they do more damage to us than we do to them, so they could call it a victory, we keep them from attaining their goal. So we call, when you stop somebody from attaining one of their military goals, you call it a tactical victory. So this is a tactical victory for us because we keep them from getting Australia. And by the way, Australia, out of gratitude, will be one of our staunchest allies all through the Cold War, up until just very recently, when they've become, kind of, not as pro-US as they used to be. But like in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, etc., whenever we needed, somebody to help us out and send in troops, they always did, because they were, very grateful to us for saving them. And they let us put some installations in their desert areas during the Cold War as well. So that is the Battle of the Coral Sea, which keeps Australia from being taken over. All right, now this is super important. Okay, we had code breakers feverishly working on trying to break the Japanese naval code. The diplomatic code was an Operation Magic, was only going to yield so much useful intel. Like, we needed to know what they were telling their military units, especially their submarines and their various, other surface fleet ships. And so on May 10th, 1942, the Hypo Naval Intelligence Station at Pearl Harbor, under Captain Joseph Rochefort, breaks a very important code. It was the Japanese naval code, JN-25, and that's a whole story as to how that happens, which again we don't have time to get into. But this comes at a critical time, because now Yamamoto realized that our aircraft carriers were a threat. After the Battle of Coral Sea, it wasn't like the Americans were no longer a threat, because as they had thought after Pearl Harbor, they're like, okay, the Americans are still a threat because of their aircraft carriers. So what he did was he designed a trap, which would have probably worked. That what they were going to do is they were going to come across and they were going to get the island of Midway. The island of Midway is a stepping stone to an attack on Hawaii. Okay, and so they knew, and it was something we possessed. They knew we would attack. We would try to defend it, but we don't really have many ships left to defend it with, so we would have to use our aircraft carriers. So what they're going to do is they're going to have a small force go in there as kind of like a sacrificial, bait, and that small force was going to attack the island of Midway, trying to draw our aircraft carriers in. So they would be kind of, steaming towards Midway. And while our aircraft carriers were on their way to Midway, there was going to be Japanese aircraft carriers out of radar range that were going to launch all their planes. And so as our aircraft carriers were coming in, they were going to catch us in the worst possible position for an aircraft carrier, which is with your planes on the deck. When you're getting, bombed from the sky and attacked and everything, and you're trying to launch planes, it's almost impossible. And so, like, if you can catch an aircraft carrier with their planes still on the deck, they are a sitting duck. They're dead. And so that was what they were going to do. They were going to have just like all their airplanes up in the air, and they were going to catch us with our planes on the deck. And this is why I say that Yamamoto is probably the most brilliant naval mind of World War II. If we hadn't broken this code, he probably would have pulled this off. Like, he would have wiped out our aircraft carriers at Midway, and that would have been it. Like, we would have had no defenses left. But because we broke the code, we figured out his plan. And so Admiral Nimitz basically decides to turn Midway into a trap for the Japanese. And can anybody tell me, how can you turn this trap that the Japanese have set into a trap for them? It's real simple. You just reverse the strategy on them. Like, what would the strategy be? Jacob, go ahead.
Don't they have the carriers waiting like north of Midway? So when the Japanese come in and they detect them, they sight the Japanese fleet at a certain point, then the carriers waiting north of Midway launch their air groups, and they strike the Japanese fleet.
Yeah, we launch our planes first. Like, so we catch them with their planes on the deck as they're sitting out there in the ocean waiting for the order to launch their planes. So we do to them what they were going to do to us. All right. And of course, because this is one of the great turning point battles of World War II, and I just absolutely love this this movie. I'm gonna play you the trailer for Midway. So hold on a second.
There's this kid. He didn't think he could cut it. I figured it was just the usual jitters. I take him under my wing. He was right to be scared.
Parker is the greatest intelligence failure in American history.
This can never happen again. I want to make it right. At least some of the boys still want to fight.
The Japanese are planning something bigger.
So what's the target?
We believe it's Midway.
Washington disagrees.
Washington is wrong.
If we lose, the Japanese on the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles will burn.
We got the order to launch. We need to throw a punch so they know what it feels like to be hit.
We're talking about a couple dozen planes against all Japanese fleet. This isn't a fair fight. I don't know how to lead these men. They'll follow you anywhere. You know that you came through when people are counting on you. You'll be able to face anything.
So I'm going to have to agree with Jacob that this is probably one of the best World War II movies I've ever seen. So if you ever get a chance, definitely, take some time and catch it on Netflix. But essentially, to make a long story short, and by the way, the guy you saw depicted there was Dick Best. He was like one of the pilots that was the most famous out of this battle for hitting some of the carriers that we sank. in essence, we sink all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers with their pilots mostly on the deck. And those were their best pilots. Those were the guys who had made it through the insanely difficult pilot training program, which had been like, had cut just about all of the, you know, like really talented people who we would have like immediately made pilots, like didn't even make it through this program. But like the ones who did were like insanely good. And those were the guys who had hit us at Pearl Harbor. They all go down with these aircraft carriers. And from this point forward, not only are we going to have more aircraft carriers than them for like, and no matter how much, you know, they do to try to replace these aircraft carriers, we're always going to have a head start in terms of like always having more. So that's going to give us a critical advantage, but also they're going to lose their best pilots. So this is a turning point in World War II. From here on out, America in every battle is going to have 2 huge advantages. The first of which is we are going to have more aircraft carriers than them in every naval battle. So we're going to be able to outgun them in the air. And the second is that we always are going to know what they do before they do it, because we have broken their naval code. This is like one of the best kept secrets of World War II, that the Japanese naval code has been compromised, and we know every plan they are going to make before they make it. Okay, so as long as that doesn't get compromised, as long as they don't figure it out, as long as they don't change it, we are always going to have this critical advantage. That is the Battle of Midway. And while this is all happening, yes, Kenzie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, what was like the reaction in the country for them, like after all of their carriers had been taken down?
You're talking about the Japanese?
Yes.
Yeah, like okay. Again, the military guys have control of the country, so it's not like the people can just be like boo and people get kicked out of office or whatever, like it happens here. The military guys are kind of running the show. But even though this is going to really hurt Yamamoto's reputation, they're still not going to take Yamamoto out of his position as one of the top admirals. Yeah, I mean, it definitely hurts Yamamoto's reputation for sure, because, you know, he had been just unbelievably successful. He was brilliant. I mean, he really was. It wasn't that we had outsmarted him in the battle. It was, we knew what he was going to do before he did it, because we had broken the code. So it's a little unfair to him that he suffers kind of the loss of reputation there. Ethan, go ahead.
Was this when Yamamoto was just like regular admiral, or like when he was like I think there was a point where he's the Grand Admiral of the combined naval fleet?
This is where he is the Grand Admiral, because he is everything that has happened up until this point has all been Japanese victories, just all of it, like just Japanese victories, like forever. And so he, of course, gets credit, and he deserved credit, because he was super smart when he in terms of the way he set these battles.
Also, I think around this time is when that certain ship was rolled out.
Which one are you talking about?
Yamato.
Oh, okay, the Yamato, yeah. All right. So
I think with his sister ship, the Mushima or whatever.
Right.
Musashi, that's what it was.
Yeah, Musashi. I remember those names. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about what's going on in Europe. All right. The SS convened a special meeting called the Wannsee Conference in 1942, which is chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, who is constantly dogged by these rumors that he has Jewish blood in his family. So therefore he is as ruthless as possible to, you know, keep people from thinking that he is Jewish. And they're essentially trying to figure out what to do with this massive influx of Jewish prisoners from the Pale of Settlement, from Russia, essentially from all the Russian territory they've taken over, because it's just overwhelming the work camp system. There's just too many. There's just millions. Like they're not able to slave labor execute people the way they have been. And so in this meeting, which includes Heinrich Müller, Adolf Eichmann, and Roland Friesler, they're basically able to come up with a different solution. And what they do is they create 6 camps. I have that's a error on the slide. There's supposed to be six camps, known as death camps. So this is phase 3 of the Holocaust. And these camps were special factories of death. Okay, so in other words, it's like you don't show up and work. You show up and you die immediately. Okay, and they're designed to kill as many people as possible in a day. So it's like literally like a factory of death. Like kill them in the most efficient way possible with the least amount of cost, and then of course get all of the things that you can get that are useful, like they got people's spectacles, they got their limbs, they're like like from World War I when they had lost limbs, and etc. And so they just bring people in by the trainload. And what they would do is they would divide the group. The young men who could work were put into one line, and all of the other people were put in the other line. That would be the old, the sick, women with little children, all the little children, etc. And like those people were told, you are going to be deloused before you go to work. So we're going to stick you all in the showers together. And so they'd all be crowded into this room, like literally shoulder to shoulder. And then they would drop in the pellets of Zyklon B, which was this fertilizer, which gave off cyanide gas when it was exposed to the air. And there would be a horrible screaming, and people would be gasping for breath and trying to get up to the top of the room, and they'd be climbing over each other. And after about 10 minutes or so, like the entire room would be quiet, and then they'd open up the doors, and there would, like, the people inside would literally like have formed like a tangle of bodies all the way up to like a heap, which went all the way up to like a point at the top. And so if you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., they show kind of what happens inside the gas chambers as people are dying. And then the young men who hadn't been killed yet would basically be told, go in and pull all those bodies apart, take them down to the crematoriums, and basically they would just be reduced to ash, just like that. So this was like a systematic way to just kill huge numbers of people. And get rid of the evidence. Olivia, go ahead.
So what you're saying is that they would tell them they would go and take a shower, and then they would just end up killing them, like gassing them?
Yeah, those were the gas chambers. Yeah. So if you've never heard of that before, that is the way that most of the Jews died in the Holocaust, and it's just horrible. I mean, just listening to the stories from people who were there, who saw it, it's heart-wrenching. Dylan, go ahead.
Were gas chambers or just killing mass amounts of Jews used in the work camps before the death camps?
No, this is a brand new invention. This came out of the Final Solution Conference, the Wannsee Conference, and this was a way to get rid of the Jews fast enough so they could kind of stay on schedule with their genocide, basically, because they're like, the work camps just aren't killing people fast enough, So, yeah. Ethan, go ahead.
Now, I think everyone knows the deal with this situation and how there is still a considerable amount of people who think that the math doesn't check out.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why they had the IBM people come in and do up their own little statistics. IBM had like these electromechanical calculators that were used to kind of count things, and so even Himmler didn't believe, that they had quite gotten rid of all the Jews. Now, of course, don't forget that they're also executing large numbers of other undesirables, like the gypsies and Russian prisoners of war. So about half of the people who die in the Holocaust camps are actually Russian prisoners of war, these soldiers that are captured in these big, battles. And then Faith, go ahead. What were you going to say?
They were also on this special diet thing that was supposed to just starve them to death over a period of 6 months. So
Yes.
you weren't like, if you were in there for any longer than 6 months, you would have basically starved to death.
Right.
And some of the pictures that I've seen, like of the way that the people looked, like how skinny they looked, like you could see every little bit of their skeleton. It was horrifying.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
someone else like had said, because like I was in that play where we talked about it. they would tell you were, like you said, they were going to take a shower, but people never really knew because the people in the camp knew like about the gas chambers and stuff. So they would just come in and tell some random people they were taking a shower, but they never really knew like until they got in there.
Well, and this is like you come right off the train car, and they immediately send like all of the people who couldn't go to the showers. But the young men who worked, they knew because they basically were the ones who went in and pulled apart all the bodies and took them down to the crematoriums. But they were just so desperate to live, they would do whatever they were told. Like just like there's one survivor who I remember. He, as a young man, he was one of those people, and he survived Auschwitz because Auschwitz was liberated right as he was getting to the point.
Yeah, I think they made a book about that. I think I've read it before.
Yeah, and well, he's in this series, this documentary series. There's an entire chapter of it dedicated to the Holocaust, and he's like, he basically just had a plate and something else, and that was his only possessions, and he was literally skin and bone walking around. And they show pictures of like they would go in and they would film what was in the camps when they opened the camps up, and it's just unbelievable. And when people around the world see this footage, they're just going to be in shock. Like there had been like little kind of leaks saying, oh yeah, this is what's going on, but nobody really knew the full extent. And the Nazis had basically put this propaganda thing out about how all of these people were being sent to these camps where they were just working and doing an honest day's work, and they were fine. But there was like a cover like story called Therienstadt, which was supposedly like a look inside one of these camps, but it was all fake. And all the people who were a part of that video were later executed at Auschwitz. So so the rest of the world had some inklings because there were some stories coming out, but people were just like, that's just too hard to believe. That's like, nobody's that barbaric, like they more accepted the story coming from the German government that there was just work camps, Faith, did you have something else you wanted to say before we moved on to Ethan?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of add on to what you said. Didn't the army, like the U.S. Army, like before we liberated the camps, like we didn't really know what was going on, and like people didn't really realize it until the camps were actually liberated?
Okay, so the Russians are going to be the ones who are going to liberate all the death camps. But when we come into Germany from the Western side, we are going to actually liberate a lot of the work camps. And so when the soldiers go in, their officers are like, get General Eisenhower. He has to see this. And General Eisenhower, when he saw what was going on in these big work camps like Bergen-Belsen, where they were still doing the starvation thing, he's just like, okay, just go get the cameras and just walk in and film everything. And so that's why a lot of the Holocaust footage that we have is from that. It's like where they just went in and they just filmed everything, because he's like, we have to know what we're fighting for. This is what we're fighting for, is to stop this kind of thing. So,
and also, didn't they see like how starved the people were, and they tried to feed them, but it was a shock to their bodies, and a lot of them ended up dying even after they were liberated?
So some of the Holocaust camp people who had been starving for so long, when you don't eat, your stomach shrinks, and so like their stomachs had shrunk to the point where when they tried to eat, they ate too much, and it caused their stomachs to burst and they died. So, but a lot of the people who were in these camps were attended to by doctors who knew what to do to get them back to health. But sometimes that did happen, yes. And Ethan, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, it's like, isn't like from the footage of when the Russian troops came into like the actual death camps, isn't there like the footage of that's not really much there? There's kind of sparse.
They blew up a lot of this stuff. Yeah, they tried to destroy the evidence of what they had done, but there were some camps where the Russians just got there too quick and they couldn't.
Yeah, I think it's like off the top of my mind, I'm pretty sure there's only like 1 or 2 videos from like Russian people in those actual death camps.
Yeah, so we don't
yeah, like most of the videos we see about the Holocaust are from the work camps.
From the work camps in the East, right? Because the Americans Yeah, and the British did a lot more.
Yeah,
filming.
but the Jews aren't gonna really like it when the Russians come through because they aren't exactly the angel saviors that they
You mean
expect.
Stalin isn't a great guy? You mean he's almost as bad as Hitler in some ways? Wow. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And the world's going to realize that pretty soon. But I just wanted, before we end, to name off the 6 death camps. They are in order of kind of magnitude: Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is the biggest one, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, where there would actually be a rebellion among the camps, or the prisoners, and that would cause Sobibor to be destroyed before the other ones, Chelmno and Belzec. And like, I think Auschwitz could kill 30,000 people a day, but and dispose of their bodies. And the other ones were somewhere in the range of 15,000 or a little higher than that. So that is the final solution, which is implemented in 1942, and of course would run through the rest of the war. So we'll actually talk about this. But I have a slide on the Holocaust, and we're going to talk about this when we get to it. But we are out of time for today. So thanks everybody for being a part. And we covered a lot of the really important stuff in World War II. And we will pick up from here when I see you guys on Tuesday. So have a great rest of your weekend.
Adios.
Adios.